1. The Brannan was a piece of shit. Saff sighed as he stowed away his bags in the room selected for him, unable to think of anything else besides how lackluster the ship was when compared to the newer models he'd trained on. When he'd taken a position with the OZA, he'd imagined a proper position, maybe in a shipyard where he'd get a fancy uniform and a normal schedule. What he definitely hadn't wanted was to be assigned to a salvager squad, stuck in a ship that looked like a barely functioning survivor of the last corporate wars. Unlike the others on the ship, though, he was one of 3 official employees of the OZA Corporation working in this salvage detail. Not that it did him much good, he thought with a slight groan, as his overhead storage compartment door swung back open for the 3rd time and dumped all his stuff into the floor. The latch was broken, just like the hot water heater which had busted completely died the 2nd day of their mission. Everyone else on the ship was just a hired hand. Individuals that worked hard for whatever corporation would pay them to risk their lives taking apart one old mine, space station, or whatever needed to be built or salvaged. Saff was different. He was an engineer who got to oversee the process and answer directly to the OZA Mining Corporation, even though they did a lot more than mining these days. And if he lasted long enough, he might even retire out to one of the nicer planets in the quadrant, with a pension to boot. "Hey newbie, you gonna join me in the boss man, or are we supposed to wait for you all night?" Telos asked him, opening the room door without knocking. Telos was tall, taller than Saff, and taller than their boss, Captain Buckard. Skinny, with the slightly stretched proportions of someone who'd spent most of their time in space. If Saff had to guess, he'd say that Telos had probably grown up on a corporate colony station. He had pale skin and shifty eyes, something that Saff expected from the data salvagers. Unlike the mechanical guys, which was his specialty, Telos hooked himself straight up to whatever networks needed to be processed to scan them internally. Supposedly, it was quicker that way. Either way, it freaked Saff out. He couldn't imagine willingly being hooked up to a computer like that. To him, there seemed like easier ways to die besides frying your mind. "Sorry," Saff muttered. "I'm coming," he added, not liking the whine in his voice as he tried to stow his gear. After all, he held a little rank around here. Not as much as Telos, but it wasn't like he was without a corporation. He was a salaried worker, more than could be said for that rabble on the lower decks of the ship, who had spent the entire trip drinking, gambling, and watching erotica that Saff was pretty sure was illegal on every civilized planet. At least he hoped so. "Oh, and by the way, here you go." Telos started and tossed him a roll of tape. "What's this for?" Saff asked, following him down the corridor towards the captain's mess, which was basically a large closet with a small table and food dispenser. "Put it on everything with a door in your room," Telos told him with a small laugh. "Why would I do that? We've got to make a small jump before we hit the planet. Trust me, you're going to want that," Telos told him and then walked faster, apparently growing tired of the conversation. Saff was about to fire off another question about why the ship wasn't being fixed or properly taken care of, but knew that it was useless. What could he say that a man like Telos wouldn't already know? Entering the mess area, Saff was pleasantly surprised the food actually smelled pretty damn editable. At least it seemed like the food dispensers were working correctly in the captain's mess. So far, they'd been eating freeze-dried foods, but it looked like tonight they were in for a real treat. Inside the room, already sitting at the table and lighting a cheap cigar, was Captain Buckard. He was a short, stocky man with dark skin. His head was shaved down to the skin, and his beard was bushy and long enough that it touched his chest. In his right ear he wore 3 golden studs. If it weren't for his OZA uniform, Saff would have thought he was a pirate. As a salvager, it probably wasn't that far off. Part of being a good salvage crew was having the ability to get all the good stuff before a rival corporation showed up. "I want to go over a few things." "Yes, sir," Saff replied, snapping quickly to attention. Telos and Buckard looked at each other. "I see you weren't joking about this kid, T." "I know. I hope it doesn't spread," Telos replied. Saff was confused. Buckard waved for him to lower his salute. "Don't ever fucking do that again, okay, kid?" "Yeah, sir," Saff answered him. "And drop the sir stuff, too. We're Salvagers, the galaxy's garbage/repo men. Not a band of troubleshooters, so we don't need all that corporate pseudo-military jargon, not on my ship." Buckard told him sternly, waving the cigar around and getting ashes all over the table. "Yes, Captain," Saff said, unsure. Buckard smiled. "Close, call me Buckard." "But CA," Saff started. "Buckard, or if you prefer shithead, fuckface," Buckard told him in mock seriousness. "Whatever, gets my attention." "Okay." Okay," Saff replied. Buckard smiled. "Good, now that's out of the way. Tell us what's for dinner tonight." Telos pressed a button, and food came out of a slot. Mountains of synthetic meat and vegetables. Well, it looks like meat covered with stuff and gravy. But it's most likely just goop that the particle creators string together in edible form. "It's better than nothing," Buckard reminded them. "So eat up. We touched down in less than 4 hours." Saff didn't need to be told twice and quickly tucked into his meal before hurrying back to his quarters to get ready for touchdown. Less than 6 hours later, the OZA salvage ship touched down on the planet affectionately known as Mine-198. Saff was the first one off. Behind him came Buckard and Telos. The rest of the men independents they had hired on Terra V to help in the dismantling of the mine filed out behind them. Buckard hadn't wanted half of them since they seemed to be so green, but with management breathing down their necks, the boss hadn't exactly had time to find more experienced men. Buckard moved ahead of the group and spat loudly down onto the dark red clay that made up the surface of Mine-198. It was barely even big enough to be called a planet, more of a planetoid, really. Which was probably the reason the mine was already being shut down and salvaged. A place this small just meant their job would be that much easier. He didn't know why management was in such a rush to have them here. As far as he was concerned, Mine-198 was nothing more than a milk run. Saff looked up at the large, angry red sun that glared down on Mine-198's surface and groaned. He hated planets that orbited too close to their sun. The increased heat would make his already miserable job that much worse. The planet he'd trained on had been like this, and he'd loathed every minute. He was already sweating inside his suit. The sooner they got into the mine, the better off he'd be. At least the company had thought to outfit them with sun suits that helped to block out the heat and harmful radiation. One of the very few precautions the company took when it came to sending their salvagers to backwater planets like this. The independents were on their own, however. Saff thought the heat in his suit was near unbearable, but looking at the contractors with their clothes sticking to them, thick with sweat and their skin already showing signs of sunburn, he felt just a little cooler. He would still prefer it if they were already below ground and away from the sun's harmful rays, though. Buckard looked around and hollered, "What are you men standing around looking at? Move out." Buckard looked at Telos and shook his head as he led the way towards the looming entrance to the mine. Telos, the third member of the OZA corporate team, got their old, rusted roller moving. Saff didn't see how. The thing was piled high with packs of gear and rigged with other miscellaneous tools. Before he could even ask what half of them were for, they were standing in front of the entrance to Mine-198. It was a simple, hard steel building that was only 60 feet tall. Saff knew, however, that its size above ground was nothing compared to the mines below it, which would most likely span for miles and miles. That was the thing with OZA Corp mines. They always looked tiny from the outside in comparison to what they contained. Over the years, corporate had realized that building too much above ground was a good way to get bombed by rivals or raided by pirates. Mine-198 was supposed to be the fourth deepest out of all the OZA-controlled mining planets. If what he had heard was true, some of the tunnels were supposed to snake all the way through the planet's core. A dangerous and now thankfully outlawed mining practice. Too bad that there was probably nothing left behind worth taking. Getting a little extra on the side was the only thing that made being a salvager bearable. He shrugged, settling his gear more thoroughly on his back, and trudged with the others through the enormous steel doors of Mine-198. Even through the suit, he could feel the immediate drop in temperature. The thick concrete and steel mixture of the building, keeping out the worst of the surface's heat. The others also seemed to be relieved too. He wondered how many of them would be in a sick bay on the ride back. Already, a few were showing signs of sun poisoning. Saff stood off with Buckard and listened to the clanking of the roller's tracks on the metal floor as Telos slowly came to join them. Telos handed the roller controls off to one of the hired hands that would take it down to the depths with them. Saff could never get over how twitchy Telos always appeared. It was the first thing he'd noticed when he'd been assigned to their ship. He just hoped that it wouldn't hinder their mission. The sooner they could get out of here, the better as far as he was concerned. Buckard spat again and looked around. Under the harsh electric light, Saff could see that in certain places the roof was sagging and the walls were lined with cracks and rust. They sure let this go to shit, he said, gesturing to the halls and rooms around him, which were also in complete disarray. Telos looked at him. "You've been here before, sir?" "Yeah. I helped install some modulators, even taught some basic safety classes back when Mine-198 was first chosen for harvesting," he said. "But that was also 80 years ago for this planet's cycle." 80 years? Saff asked. "Yeah, space-time dilation still weirds me out too," he muttered. "Technically, this planet's year cycle is about 10 times shorter than the one back on Terra V, which we won't be going back to. After this we're heading to the nearest Corp station. Which is why, Saff, so many of these shitbirds joined us. More than half of them are probably wanted back on Terra V," he told them. The message there was pretty clear. Don't turn your back on them for a minute. For most closeouts, the 3 of them would have been enough. Buckard had been angry about having to bring on so many hired hands, but the orders had been non-negotiable. Saff didn't know how it worked for other companies, but in the OZA, when management gave you an order, it wasn't negotiable. The independents moved off to the far wall, shuffling awkwardly through the hallway and organizing themselves over by the large cargo lift that would take them down into the mine, while Saff and the others waited near the entrance. They wouldn't be going down with the rest. That was much too dangerous even for them. Right now the men were restless but eager to work. But there was no reason to take chances. They were packed in tight. The upper areas of the mines were never used to accommodate such large parties, as much of the living quarters and working areas were below. The upper areas were mostly used for clerical duties and offloading areas for drop ships. Saff and the other corporate employees would sit in the upper command office and monitor the workers' progress. Far enough away that no one got any ideas about overpowering them and jacking the ship. "Listen up," Buckard bellowed so he would be heard. His voice carried through the packed hallway, loud enough to stop any idle conversation between the workers as they turned to listen. "We are only going to go through tunnels 1 through 4. Grab anything valuable and not tied down. Put it in your packs. If you find valuable minerals or ore, put it on the roller. Once your team is finished, place the detonation charges in your assigned tunnel. And remember, any edible or personal items left behind are yours to divide amongst yourself. And trust me when I say there will be plenty of loot down there for you all, without having to resort to stealing from the company." Saff nodded his head in agreement. It never failed when the OZA labeled a mine to be closed. They simply pulled all the miners and other personnel out, usually leaving the places in the worst possible condition. Then they sent in guys like Buckard and Telos, sometimes with crew, but usually in small teams, to scavenge everything worth taking and to make sure that any sensitive or useful material was pulled for the company's records. Next, they would blow it all to hell so none of their competition could roll in and set up shop. After Buckard split them into 10-man teams, the others wasted no time using the lift to ferry themselves and the large roller down. While they were doing that, Saff and Telos made their way to the command room. "These other guys are just for the heavy lifting," Buckard told him as they passed, reminding them to stay out of the other workers' way. "I want you and Telos to work with the data systems and to monitor the workers' progress from the control room. Also, go through some of the operation reports and see if there are any small loads left we can hit while we are here. It would be nice to get a bonus if we can. Damn, Saff thought miserably. The last thing he wanted to do was dig through old operation files for mineral reports. From the look on Telos' face, the older man felt the same way. Saff hated the extra work, but to be honest, he didn't hate the idea of a bonus. He definitely wouldn't mind a little extra money next time he took some R&R. Saff followed Telos down the corridor towards the control room. It was smaller than some others Saff had been in. A large monitor took up most of the inner wall, with an adjacent room to store all the data systems. Everything here was outdated. Massive data terminals lined the walls, and if he wasn't mistaken, even several drawers of physical files. He and Telos removed their own nano hard drives and prepared to transfer files from the terminals. The physical files would have to be destroyed with the rest of the mine, if they had the time to look through it. Anything worthwhile would have to be scanned in manually. Saff really hoped they wouldn't have the time, because as the newest addition to the crew, that would end up being his job. Hey look, Saff. Some idiots left the coffee behind. Telos said cheerfully, turning on the percolator. They really must have been in a hurry if they left the coffee behind. Saff thought to himself, wondering how much he and Telos could get for a pound on the black market. Even if he found nothing else, that alone would make for a pleasant bonus. And with all the ration shortages lately, coffee was definitely an item worth taking. Saff had heard that on some colony worlds, a couple pounds of coffee could net enough dough for someone to live like a king for years, making it strange that it was left behind at all. Maybe they were here so long that they didn't know its worth. Saff said, though he still could not believe that someone would have just left it behind. Maybe. Telos muttered. That, or they were just in that much of a hurry to get out of here and get back to civilization. And why would that be? Saff asked, looking away from the large monitor and then rechecking his transfer status. He couldn't help feeling like these file transfers were going to take forever. Both of them were still at their first terminals, and they were about 20 in all. He really hoped that the rest of the crew was making better progress with the roller. Notice anything strange about the layout of this place? Telos asked with a knowing grin. No, should I have? Saff asked, looking back over the map of the central compound. Telos laughed as he poured 2 cups of the strong dark brew. Yeah, in this whole compound they didn't have any pleasure rooms. Saff almost spit his coffee everywhere, and not just from the liquid's intense heat, but a mining world without pleasure rooms. No wonder they were all so eager to get out of here. Telos was still shaking his head with mirth. Just think of it, all those workers and not even a vice hall. Somebody here must have really pissed off some big wig back at corporate. Telos was having to hold his sides, so he wouldn't accidentally topple from his chair. There was a ding, indicating that Telos' first terminal transfer was complete. Saff couldn't understand why they wouldn't have pleasure rooms or vice halls. Every mine did so that way, workers were more relaxed, and there were fewer incidences of violence between them. It was a wonder that Mine-198 still stood at all. Poor bastards. Was this a prison world? Saff asked. They had been quite popular before the corporate wars. Unpaid prisoners, forced to work off their sentences in the employ of the very corporations that they had wronged. But after the wars, the newly formed Council of Worlds had gotten rid of them, making it clear that such things were a little too close to outright slavery for their taste. Nope, every employee on Mine-198 was in good standing with the OZA Corporation. Telos replied, looking at the employee data files. Buckard walked in just after Saff's first transfer was completed. 2 down, 18 left to go. Hey, did you guys notice anything strange about the map of this? He asked, sending Telos into another fit of laughter. 2. Bukkard was just as excited about the coffee as they had been. His rough demeanor melted away by the bitter dark nectar and the thoughts of easy profits. The file transfers were still on schedule, However, Buckard had gotten Saff to work on scanning the physical files one by one to his chagrin. Telos now had to work both of the transfer devices, leaving Saff to figure out what exactly OZA would find valuable information-wise and what needed to be destroyed immediately. Corporations like the one they worked for rose and fell by the speed of information. If they left anything behind that could be used by rivals, then not only would they be risking their career but also their lives. Corporate takeovers were messy affairs, ones that workers like him rarely survived. Telos was busy deleting anything that could be harmful in the wrong hands. Mostly percentage yield reports. If anyone knew exactly how much raw material a corporation had access to, then they couldn't ask the ridiculously sky-high prices for it, or use it to extort the colony worlds. The corporation's paranoia was limitless. While they would most likely be the last people to ever walk the floors of Mine-198, they had to show proof that they'd destroyed all sensitive material after transfer prior to full closeout. Saff didn't understand how the company thought their rivals could pull data off of obliterated terminals, but Buckard swore it could be done. Buckard watched the large monitor, noting the progress of the various work crews. "Looks like the others are making good progress," he said aloud to no one in particular. "Hey Saff, you find anything interesting?" he asked. Even Telos looked up from his work and waited for Saff's response. The boredom of the three men was almost palpable. "Nothing worthwhile, mostly just missing or DOA reports," Saff answered, thumbing through the various files spread out in front of him. Most of the physical files were medical or personnel records. Which was strange, but they knew better than to question the OZA. "Must be a lot if you're seeing a pattern," Buckard asked, suddenly interested. The older man fidgeted with the watch on his left arm, checking the time. Saff knew without Buckard saying anything that they were still on schedule. He figured that the other man would have been barking orders at them if they weren't. Saff stopped and thought about it for a minute. No, not when you consider the lack of entertainment for the workers. It's actually surprising there aren't more based on the numbers of workers that were here, he answered. Buckard nodded in affirmation. "Wait a minute," Saff said. "This is weird. It looks like there was a large unit of troubleshooters stationed here." He showed them a thick file marked classified before he scanned it. "Does it say why?" Buckard asked, walking over. "Probably to keep the men in line." Telos chortled, not looking up from his work. Saff wasn't so sure. Troubleshooters were elite corporate soldiers. Ones that could do whatever they thought necessary when following the OZA's mission. They were a valuable corporate resource, and the OZA didn't waste resources. So why were they stationed here on a backwater mine? Makes sense, I guess. It seems dangerous, though, having that many soldiers around with disgruntled workers. Seems like the last thing they would want is a bunch of weapons lying around a powder keg like this, Buckard wondered aloud. He couldn't help but think they were missing something here. He wanted to order Saff to dig in more, but anything dealing with troubleshooters was outside of his pay grade and would most likely end up drawing the corporation's ire. All it would take is for one of them to ask the wrong questions the next time they checked in. Telos suddenly swore. "Looks like we have a problem. The medical files refuse to transfer. The terminal is asking for an access code." Buckard came over and put his in. The screen flashed red. "That's not good," Buckard told them. Not good at all, he thought. The only way that file could be locked against a Salvagers extraction code would be by a chairman. And if one of the chairmen was locking files against transfer, that would mean the reason for closing out Mine-198 differed from the official transcript. "Are there any other locked files?" he asked. Telos shook his head. "Saff?" Buckard asked. "There's a lot of very redacted troubleshooter after-action reports over here," he said, his mouth suddenly parched. "Troubleshooters died here?" Buckard asked, steadying himself against one of the tables. Telos gulped nervously. "Should I call back the teams?" "No, not yet. We have to scavenge as much as we can to meet quota, but we might forego the extra loads and any bonus." Send out a message for the teams to just locate tools and technology. The sooner we blow this place, the better. Bokard rubbed his jaw, sad at the loss of the extra compensation. Saff, how many deaths? He asked, his curiosity piqued. Officially none. It wasn't until I looked at the actual troop numbers, I found it. They left here with 100 less troubleshooters than they came with. He said. The redacted files are more or less mission briefs than an actual cause of death reports. Telos stopped what he was doing and looked over at Bokard. 100 troubleshooters. Is it possible we were just supposed to detonate instead of sticking around and hauling anything out? He asked. Telos was visibly sweating. The man never had much backbone. Bokard shook his head. No. The contract I received from the higher-ups was for a scavenging job, take whatever isn't nailed down from the first 4 tunnels and detonate on departure. The only addendum to it was to bring more crews than usual. Hell, they even sent me the coin to hire them on with. Sir, I mean Bokard, is there any reason the company would hold vital information from you? Saff asked, still sifting through files. What kind of backwater mine still used hard copy files on top of digital? He thought miserably for the 100th time, making sure he missed nothing important. Maybe Telos was right, and someone here was on one of the chairman's shit list. That would explain the paper files and lack of pleasure rooms or vice halls. Bokard sat down and thought for a minute. If it was secret or could embarrass the company, but they wouldn't withhold information that would directly hinder us. After all, that could interfere with the bottom line. He said, slightly puzzled at Saff's question. Telos nodded in agreement. The company would never do anything to jeopardize the bottom line, or that would embarrass the chairman in front of the Council of Worlds, not to mention it could hurt future investments. Perhaps we should try to speed things up. That way, we can get out of here sooner than planned. If the OZA thought that something here could embarrass them, or the shareholders, perhaps it would be best if we didn't dig too deep, or gave the workers below too much time to look around, Telos said, his voice still shaken. Bokard agreed. It could be very hazardous to one's own health to uncover company secrets. And very hazardous to theirs if any of those workers found out something they shouldn't. Give out the order. The teams are to grab whatever is within reach and plant their charges. We are going to close out Mine-198 sooner than expected. Hell, maybe we will even get a bonus for a speedy closeout. He told them, sounding more optimistic than he felt. Telos chuckled. Stranger things have happened. The large monitor blipped one of the red dots in the tunnel system and suddenly turned black. What was that? Bokard asked. Telos leaned back in his chair. Team 5 just went black, sir, Telos whispered. What the hell does that even mean? Bokard asked. Although he knew exactly what something like that meant. One member of each team was outfitted with a specialized GPS device that managed not only their positions, but their vitals as well. Changing from red to black meant death. The device usually helped to monitor for gas leaks or cave-ins. But for a team to go black that quickly without so much as last transmission was almost unheard of. Team 4, come in, Team 4. Saff called out over the intercom. No response. How does an entire team just go black with no communication beforehand? Telos asked, starting to sweat again. Team 4, do you have eyes on Team 3? Saff asked into the comm system. Be alert for signs of possible cave-ins. He told them, clicking off his comm. Usually, that was the only thing that could make an entire team go black with no warning. But they hadn't felt anything below them, and none of the monitors showed a change in seismic activity. Negative, no cave-ins. We are heading back now. Can I speak freely? The voice on the other side of the line asked. Of course, Bokard answered, taking the communicator from Saff. There was a pause, and then the voice came flooding back through the comm unit. Sir, I know I'm new to this, but I swear something down here is following us. It clicked back off. The three of them all exchanged looks. What do you mean? Bokard finally asked. They all waited in anticipation for the reply. Telos looked like he was about to get up and run back to the ship. The only thing keeping him in place was a stern look from Buckard. "Something seems to be following us through the tunnels, sir. We keep hearing a clicking noise from a distance. There it is again," he said. The voice clicked back off. Buckard held the communicator and slammed his fist into the table. "Don't go towards it. All teams clear the tunnels now." Saff and Telos were startled. "What's going on?" Buckard looked up at them, feeling the numbness in his now bruised fingers. "Damn it. I don't know, but whatever it is, it can't be good," he said to them. Spoken like a true salvager, thought Saff. The comm unit flared back to life. "Mayday. Team 3 needs help, dead," the voice said, its speech broken up with heavy chunks of static. It clicked off as suddenly as it had came on, leaving the three of them sitting in an eerie silence. Saff couldn't help but compare it to the calm before a storm. Team 4 blipped off the large monitor, their red dot blinking out to black. Telos dropped his coffee, shattering the mug and sending the hot liquid seeping into his boots. The communicator remained silent. Buckard opened the hard case they always brought with them, but had never opened. From it he produced several weapons, 2 laser pistols and 1 assault rifle. From the looks of it, it was an old troubleshooter model, all black with the skull and crosshairs insignia. All 3 bore the OZA stamp and seal. Buckard noticed the 2 of them looking at it as he gave them the pistols. "It shoots titanium cord rounds. Just in case," he said, motioning at the rifle. Saff and Telos just nodded, not really knowing what else to say. Saff asked, "What are your orders?" Buckard looked at them and summoned the lift. "We go below and see what's going on, find whoever is left down there, and then get the hell out of here." Saff and Telos shared a look that was what they were afraid he was going to say. 3. Less than 5 minutes ago, John Lockbridge and Tony Ferrer had been joking with each other when their communicators started to sound off. They had both been recruited off-world to come here and sweat. It had not been all bad for them, though. They had found cocoa powder and several grams of sugar left over in Tunnel 1's cafeteria, which would fetch a fine price on the black market, more than enough for them to live comfortably for a while until they found another salvage operation. They had all received Buckard's last transmission, but no one was eager to leave without searching for more loot, especially when there was so much lying around for the taking. They'd be crazy to leave it down there to rot. OZA was paying them well for this little job, but not well enough to leave a small fortune in a condemned tunnel. The comm buzzed again. Ferrer answered it, pressing the button on the device and holding it up to his ear. Unlike the corp guys, the higher-ons like him were given the oldest, most outdated shit possible. Even with the button held down, he could still hear the static in the background as the device struggled to get a signal through miles of rock. "Yeah, boss?" he asked, keeping his eyes peeled as John divvied up their latest find, several ounces of coffee. And not the synthetic stuff either, good stuff that would let them live the high life for a while on whatever backwater planet the OZA dumped them on after the run. He observed the other man, making sure he wasn't trying to short him. They'd agreed on 50-50 split, and while he liked the John well enough, he also knew how things worked on a scavenger run. At the end of the day, it was every man for themselves. Team 3 and 4 just went dark. Everyone is to set their detention charges and head to the lift. We're closing out the mine now. Captain Buckard's voice boomed through the now grainy-sounding communicator. He must be in the lift on his way down, Ferrer thought, realizing that whatever was going on, it had to be serious if they were going to oversee the work. The corporate workers usually never came down into the tunnels, unless the job specially stated they had to. They had enough to do up top, and it kept the peace between the two groups. No one liked to be micromanaged, especially when most of them were stealing, but to the galactic corporations, that was just the price of doing business. Taking all the extra rations to sell on the black market was the only reason most people agreed to take the work in the first place. "Sure thing, boss," Ferrer replied, rolling his eyes. John had to stifle a laugh. "Those other groups must be taking a nap," John said with a nasty laugh. "That, or they found something really worthwhile, and want us out of the way while they get it. Don't get it twisted. Those corpies aren't that different from us. They're loading their pockets up top, just like we are down here. Tony replied, grabbing his pack. He rubbed his hands together at the thought. Both men headed down the tunnel, with smiles on their faces at the thought of the type of loot that would make a corporate employee come down the lift and make two teams turn off their comms. One thing was for sure, it would be a lot more than the coffee and other spices they'd been packing away. They headed outside of the small storeroom they'd found, and back into the corridor. The rest of Team 1 was still loading down the roller with leftover ore, copper wire, and anything else not bolted down. One man was even trying to yank the appliances off the wall in the cafeteria. The more heavy scrap they brought topside, the bigger their bonus would be. Hey, we need to head over to 4's last position. Team 3 and them aren't answering their comms. Those assholes must have found something good because they've gone dark, and now the corpies are coming down the shaft, all worried. Tony said, looking pointedly at a man coming out of a bunk area carrying every blanket and towel he could hold without tripping over them. He started down the corridor, an interspersed section where metal walls gave way to earthen ones. The rest of the team quickly shouldered their gear and followed him. They let their greed guide them. After all, a team only went dark when they either found something they didn't want the OZA handlers to know about or they were dead. Since there wasn't anything that could hurt them in an empty old mine and the corporate wars were over, he could only speculate what the teams had found. He was guessing tech or pharmaceuticals. Drugs, especially painkillers given to the mine workers sold on the black market, could set a person up for the rest of their life. As long as the corporation they got them from never found out. Tony was the first to come across Team 3. He stood stock still as John ran up to him. "Hey Tony, why AR?" he began, but then stopped too as he noticed he was standing in something wet and red. His boots squished in a large puddle of gore. Tony was completely silent for once, as they both surveyed the scene laid out before them. Team 3 was in pieces. Pieces which were smeared all up and down the corridor. For all they knew, Team 4 could be mingled in there somewhere. Tony couldn't help but think, still too shocked to move. That's when they heard it. A clicking noise came from further down the corridor. To Tony, it sounded like a million little hammers banging against rocks. The sound of either one giant beast with many legs, or many beasts with smaller ones. Whatever it was, all the men knew it shouldn't be here. All around them, the rest of the Team 1 and 2 backed up and started back towards Tunnel 1. John pulled Tony back, trying to force him to move. "Come on, we have to go," he shouted. Behind him came the sounds of some others getting sick. The smell of blood and offal in the tight tunnels was overbearing. He'd finally got Tony to start moving when he saw them. A horde of insect-like creatures that poured down from Tunnel 4, and like a wave, crashed into the men at the crossroads. They looked like a nasty mix between a scorpion and a spider. Too many eyes, legs, and nasty grabbing pincers. They were the size of dogs, covered in all black, chitin-like plates. They moved side to side, like a centipede or a massive earwig. The worst part was the mouths, large holes in the center of their elongated heads, filled with razor-like teeth and mandibles to pull in their prey. John knew that no matter what happened, he didn't want to end up in one of those things' mouths. Tony stopped moving again, as people began to die around them. He was frozen in shock. John did the only thing he could think of. He pushed him directly into the horde of on-rushing creatures and booked it down the hallway. Other boot steps echoed behind them, and so did the screams. The screams that echoed through the tunnels only helped to make him run faster. "Sorry, Tony, but at least this way one of us gets off this damn rock," John thought to himself as he heard Tony's scream get suddenly choked off. As he turned down Tunnel 1, he realized that even Tony's death hadn't bought him enough time as men died all around him. John knew he would never make it to the lift before one of those creatures got him. They were just too fast. Even with the lift on its way down, he would be devoured before the doors even opened, and with nothing to defend himself, there wasn't much he could do to buy himself time before they did. He was back near the roller. Looking around, he found a spiked rock hammer and a mining laser. Maybe with these, he would have a chance. He heard the creatures as they scrambled towards him. The surviving men from the teams were quickly swarmed as the creatures covered them, biting and twisting in on themselves to strengthen their hold. The men were pulled down, and more of the creatures piled on. Some continued to struggle on the ground, fighting in vain. Eventually, the men stopped fighting and were consumed by a writhing mass of shiny black-plated bodies. Not all of them were that lucky. John saw with horror that some of them were carried off, bloodied, kicking and screaming. Perhaps there was something worse than being immediately eaten. He thought suddenly, not liking his odds out in the open, laser or no laser. Not me, not today, John told himself as he ran towards the small room he and Tony had found earlier. He ran inside of it and went to slam the door shut. His last sight was of the creatures dragging off the dead, along with the living. "Help me, please," a man from Team 2 shouted as he was being dragged off, his hands outstretched towards John's hiding place. He finished slamming the door shut, not looking away from the man. John could only listen to the man's continued screams from behind the safety of the door. Using the mining laser, John welded shut the metal door, hoping that way he would be safe inside behind the metal door. There were still rations inside the storage closet, so he could survive until OZA sent in their troubleshooters. Yes, all he had to do was wait and everything would be fine. The thought brought little comfort. If he had wanted to be confined to a small room for hours on end, he would have stayed and faced his sentencing on Terra V. He heard a scratching sound that seemed to get louder and louder. He looked everywhere, but could not find the source. The back wall moved outwards, the metal being pushed out and then burning. An acidic chemical smell filled the air as the metal of the back wall buckled and oozed from the acidic stream. John stood with his back to the door. No way out. His safe room had just become his prison. Something large made its way out of the hole as more of the acid sizzled and dripped onto the floor. The head was the size of one of the creatures out there, but larger. It moved on a snake-like body, except at its torso it had 4 arms, each equipped with a 3-clawed taloned hand. John screamed as the creature pulled itself out of the hole. Its attention entirely locked on to him. John tried to kick the damn thing's grasping hands as it reached for his legs, trying to pull him into the hole, but that caused him to stumble and fall. He knocked down one of the large pantry shelves onto its tail and grabbed for his hammer. The thing screeched as the heavy shelf crushed part of its softer serpentine form. It rubbed the mandibles that pulled prey into its mouth together and gnashed its rows of teeth in a way John could only think to call angry. The screech it emitted was almost deafening. He smashed its outstretched hand with the hammer, but another quickly took its place. The creature was covered in wriggling appendages, seeking to grab him and pull him into the darkness. Then it pounced, trapping John under its bulk. He screamed as its acidic juices burned through his uniform and into his chest. He screamed even louder as that horrid mouth hungrily met his shoulder. The acidic smell mingled with that of burning flesh as the creature dragged him into the darkness below. He felt as his arm and upper body went numb. Something in the creature's bite was paralytic. John screamed for help, but there was no one left to hear him. 4. The lift was slow, too slow. Saff hadn't expected it to be fast, since they were going thousands of feet below ground, but he hadn't expected it to take more than a half hour to get down there either. What was the point of them coming to the rescue if it took forever for them to get there? Unlike Telos, however, he was trying to do his best not to show how nervous he was. The taller man seemed like he was on the verge of the panic attack. Saff didn't blame him. He didn't know what they were about to walk into. Even in training, he'd heard stories of salvage crews just disappearing while on a run, never to be heard from again. Telos kept fidgeting with his pistol. "What do you think is down here anyway?" he asked, even more jumpy than he'd been on the surface. Bockard looked at him. "I hope what we have is just some wannabe miners too greedy for their own good, or a saboteur working for another corporation. My money would be on GYNZO. Those bastards put their nose in everything out this way. Especially if it belongs to the OZA Corporation," he said. Bockard remembered all too well the lengths GYNZO would go when it came to sabotaging OZA operations. He still had scars from the war to prove it. Telos cursed, and Saff couldn't help but to agree. After all, it wouldn't be the first time a rival corporation had attempted to steal from a salvager mission. It was the perfect time to strike, since most salvager ships were undermanned and had limited resources. They could easily slip a small team of guys into one of the freelance salvage crews and have them create enough havoc and map out the good stuff for the other corporation's troubleshooters to come in and clean up. Those troubleshooters, elite soldiers sent to take care of corporate problems, would then come down and kill off the rival's employees and link up with the saboteurs. For many corporations, it was considered a good business practice. That was, of course, as long as their actions weren't brought to the council's attention. Hence, the reason they had to kill all the witnesses. I didn't pick up any small craft on Mine-198, and there was nothing in orbit. Saff told them he had checked their ship's radar several times before they had landed. Telos wasn't the only worried. It was Saff's first mission, and if a mistake was made, he'd done his best to ensure that he wasn't the one who made it. "Means nothing," Buckard muttered. "Just because they don't have an immediate way off the planet doesn't mean they don't have some comrades in wait for an orbital transponder signal." This time it was Saff that cursed. If Buckard was right and this was an enemy corporation sabotage, there was a very high probability that none of them would leave here alive. They would probably make the whole thing look like an accident. Just another detonation gone wrong by a half-cocked salvage crew. It really made you wonder how many of the salvager missions that went wrong were really accidents in the first place. None of that mattered now. If it was truly corporate espionage, there wasn't anything any of them could do about it right now, except be on the lookout for traps. If they survived and be able to testify against the saboteurs, it would mean a big payout from OZA. Especially if Buckard was right, and it was GYNZO behind it. GYNZO was unofficially a shoot-on-sight rival for the OZA, and anything that could publicly embarrass them or get them brought up before the council would mean a massive payday for the employees who pulled it off. Buckard's communicator chirped. Unlike the rest of the crews, his communicator allowed him to stay in constant communication with the main monitor, which enabled him to track the rest of the crew's progress. Saff and Telos preferred the smaller models compared to the bulky thing that Buckard carried around attached to his hip. Looking at the screen, Buckard visibly paled. There was no way what he was seeing was possible. Not if the culprit was only a couple of corporate spies. After all, none of the workers were allowed to be armed. "What's wrong?" Saff asked. "They're all gone," Buckard said slowly. "The other teams all went black." "What does that mean?" Telos asked, knowing damn well what it meant, but not wanting to say it out loud. "It means either we had a lot of rats on our ship, or there was a reason that so many trouble-a-hooters were stationed here, and it had nothing to do with miners getting out of hand." He finished in a voice that sounded more like a whisper. Saff looked up at him. "You think they found a native species?" he asked incredulously. Telos stumbled back until he leaned on the wall of the lift, as if the floor was falling from under him. "That's impossible," he said, trying to keep his voice from cracking. Buckard shook his head. "Pull yourselves together. I don't know why the damn troubleshooters were here. It changes nothing. After all, it's illegal to mine any world with life on it, so I highly doubt that they are going to break centuries-old trade laws for some backworld mine." He finished, but even he looked unsure. Corporate policy leaned more towards doing whatever you can get away with, regardless of the law. Saff suddenly felt the weight of the firearm he carried. Against humans, one of the little laser pistols could easily cut through flesh, searing it all the way through to the bone. But if they were about to stumble upon a native species, there was no telling what their strength and weaknesses were. There were some strange beings out in the universe, and not all of them had to worry about laser burns. "Look, we should reverse our course and call this a loss," Saff said. "At least until we can look through the troubleshooter's files enough to see what we might be dealing with." "No," Buckard all but growled. "We have men down here. They may be freelancers, but we at least owe it them to try to help them if they are in trouble." "What if they're dead?" "I mean all of them, not just the 4 men carrying the GPS systems," Telos asked. "Then we at least need to know what to put in the report," Buckard replied. "Because you can be damn sure that the 3 of us are in for a very lengthy debrief session when we get back." He was right. They could turn back and call it a loss and perhaps not lose their jobs for failure to comply, but they would all wonder for the rest of their lives if they could have helped those men. Even if they detonated the mine at this point, it wouldn't matter. They had to know what happened. Saff knew that, and he was sure the others thought the same way, but this way the offer to leave had been there. He was happy, in a grim way, that they hadn't taken the easy way out. It was one of the few reasons that he'd been excited to be assigned to Buckard's crew. The man was known for his moral compass, something that a lot of other corporate crews didn't have. The lift screeched to a halt at the end of the shaft. When the doors opened, they would step out into Tunnel 1, which Saff knew would be made up of the miners' quarters, a cafeteria, and storage areas. After that, there would be more rooms and corridors spread throughout the rest of the tunnels. Most salvager teams didn't go too far from Tunnel 1, unless they were certain that the richer veins or tool caches were in deeper tunnels. They usually just had the depth charges planted and left after they blew the place to bits. "Okay," Buckard said, getting their attention before the doors slid open. "We start by retracing their steps. The last place we heard from any of the teams was near the intersection. That's going to put us out in the open, facing 3 tunnels with God knows what in them. Keep your eyes peeled, and for the love of God, don't shoot each other," Buckard ordered. Saff and Telos just looked at each other and shrugged. Each of them took a firmer grip on their weapon. That's when the lift gate opened. Fluorescent light and dull metallic walls greeted them as they stepped into the entryway of Tunnel 1. And right into the remnants of the bloodbath that had just occurred there. 5. They stood still, all of them taking in the scene of slaughter before them. The floor was coated with dull red puddles and streaks where the blood had mixed with the dirt and congealed. Drag marks painted their way down the tunnel toward the intersection. No one could have lost that much blood and still lived. Saff wasn't a doctor, but even he couldn't imagine anyone walking away after losing buckets of fluids. Whatever did this couldn't have been Buckard's saboteurs. Laser fire wouldn't leave that amount of blood, and they'd be able to smell if guns were fired. Not to mention the fact that saboteurs wouldn't have bothered to move all the bodies. They just would have wiped everyone out, finished the salvage, and buried the evidence under the mine. Which meant that whatever was behind this massacre wasn't on a corporate payroll. Making them all the scarier to Saff. At least with corporate soldiers, you knew what you were in for. But not knowing that was so much worse. None of them spoke instead. They looked to Buckard, who wordlessly signaled for them to move further down the shaft. Whatever theories they'd had coming down the lift had just gone out the window, Saff thought, as they all shifted their weapons to the low ready, making it easier for them to shoot if they had to. Saff was nervous. He could feel the thick sheen of sweat between his pistol and his palm. The last time Saff had even handled a weapon was in his salvager training, which had been on non-moving dummies. And the way he heard it, Telos's claim to fame was shooting some sort of wild dog by accident outside of a bar on Theros Prime. Which was supposedly why Buckard kept all the weapons locked up. Telos took point as they went down the shaft. Buckard was in the middle, staggered off to the left, so Telos wouldn't be in his field of fire, and Saff took up the rear, staying on a constant swivel so he could watch both the front and the back. The further away they got from the lift, the more that sinking feeling in his guts started to grow. Whatever happened to those teams, he knew it couldn't be as simple as espionage or a couple of rogue salvagers. A group of men armed with tools would explain all that blood, but why the drag marks? He wondered why they didn't just leave now, but he wasn't going to be the one to voice it. He was too new to question his captain like that. And besides, if it were him down here, he'd want someone to come looking. Telos signaled for a halt with his left hand, his gun still aimed down the corridor. "What do you see?" Buckard asked, moving up towards Telos so they could whisper back and forth. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely above a whisper. Saff had to move closer just to hear them at all. But in the complete silence of the tunnels, he didn't have to strain much to hear them. Up ahead is a corridor with a small doorway, probably nothing more than a storage closet. Telos said. Buckard nodded. Saff turned around and guarded their rear as Buckard faced forward, and Telos slowly peered around the corner, his pistol at the ready. It's clear, Telos said. Buckard never looked away from his rifle. Can you open it, Telos? Saff heard as Telos tried to open the door. I think it's welded shut, but it looks like something tried to get inside, Telos said. This time, his voice had risen and now carried down the shaft as he pointed to the dented and scratched door. Shush. Buckard huffed. Saff, take point while I inspect this damn door. There's nobody left to sneak up on us from the rear, anyhow. Saff moved forward and took Buckard's position as he and Telos examined the door. Curiosity overcame him, and Saff couldn't help but turn his head to look over at the door. He immediately wished he hadn't. From what he could see between Buckard and Telos, it looked like something about hip level had repeatedly rammed into the door and left some purplish goo behind. He could hear Buckard and Telos as their voices rose to their normal level. If the teams came under attack from a native species, we need to leave now, Telos argued. They might not be company men, but they trusted us. We owe it to them to at least try to help them. Buckard replied, his tone making it clear he wasn't going to budge. We both know there's a good chance that they are all dead or worse, Telos told him gravely. I understand that, but let me ask you, Telos, what would you want me to do if it was you down here, huh? Get on the ship and leave, Buckard asked him, but loud enough that it was clear the question was for all of them. Saff could hear as Telos struggled with his reply. It doesn't matter. You're the captain. Whatever you say is what we do, but if you must know, I wouldn't want you two to throw your lives away coming to find me. Besides, it won't matter if we save them or not, because the OZA will never let some independent contractors run around with the information that they mined a habitable world, or at least one with sentient life. Get a hold of yourself, man. We don't even know that's what it is. Right now we're just jumping to conclusions. If the higher-ups were worried about that kind of exposure, they never would have sent us in the first place, and they definitely never would have allowed us to hire independents. If that's how it was, our orders would have been to set charges and leave, not do a full closeout. So there's a good chance that whatever's going on here, the OZA might not even know about it, Buckard said. When has the OZA ever been clueless? Just because the right hand doesn't know what the left is up to, doesn't mean they don't have a pretty good goddamn idea. I'd also like to point out that they won't let us live with this kind of information either, Telos told them. Saff shook his head in denial, but he knew Telos was right. One salvage team was a small sacrifice compared to being put on trial for coring out a habitable world. Corporate wars had been started for less. Buckard seemed to relent. Fine. We will go to the intersection. If we don't see anything, we'll pull back and head topside. Then we'll tell them our crews went missing and ask if they want us to blow it. Hell, burying evidence of an OZA wrongdoing will probably get all of us a promotion and a raise, Buckard said, audibly clapping Telos on the back. Happy? Telos huffed, ecstatic. Saff looked over and could see the small smile already on Telos's lips as he mentally counted how much that raise just might be. Saff couldn't argue the logic, as the corporation was notorious for scratching the backs of employees that helped cover up any sort of trade crimes. At the same time, though, they were notorious for taking the skin off the backs of those that tried to bring those crimes to light. Literally skinning them alive in some cases if the stories were to be believed. Resuming their earlier positions, they headed further up the tunnel. They stopped where the metal turned to hard-packed dirt, not because they were about to turn back, but because they couldn't believe the sight before their eyes. They had found some of the missing crewmen. Pieces of them, anyway. Human parts were strewn around, but as Saff's eyes adjusted to the horror, he noted it was only body parts, no bodies. Arms and legs that seemed to be chewed and torn from their hosts were spread out before them. Blood pooled along the metal floor, fresher than what they had come across in Tunnel 1. Whatever did this was coming back for more, carrying it off to God knows where. Saff realized. Taking the pieces off somewhere, and then coming back for the rest. As they surveyed the scene before them, he felt like he might get sick. He could feel the coffee from earlier sitting heavy in his stomach, and had to fight back the urge to vomit. They moved closer, doing their best to sidestep the puddles of gore. They gave up after a while. There was just too much, and inevitably they would have to walk across it. Saff tried to ignore the sounds as his boots squelched in the puddles of gore. Telos cleared his throat. What could do something like this, losing none of its own? He asked, no longer trying to whisper. Buckard looked at him for a moment, then his eyes went wide with realization. You're right, there's no way these many men died without taking a single one with them. Saff immediately grasped the problem. So we are either vastly outnumbered, or they took both their dead and ours with them. Which would mean sentient life, because no saboteur would go through this much trouble no matter how well they were getting paid. He said, trailing off, the full horror of the situation dawning on him for the first time. We need to leave now. We need to let the company know that we didn't see any of this. Do you know what lengths the OZA would go to make sure this never got out? To make sure this never made it to the council? Telos asked, his face contorted in a look of sheer panic. Saff crouched down on his haunches, feeling like he was going to be sick. No matter what, there was little chance that the OZA would let them live. If this got out, the OZA would hit this place with a star killer and blow the planet's core. Hell, all they would have to do is paint it nice and neat for the media. Simply state that the core was unstable after extensive mining operations. They would have to. It would be too dangerous just to collapse the shafts and move on at this point. If anyone else discovered it, well, even one of the mightiest trade corporations was nothing compared to the power wielded by the Council. And the genocide or suppression of a sentient species was a capital offense. It would mean capital punishment for all employees with knowledge of the operation, not to mention execution orders for the board of directors. In short, it would mean war, because the OZA would never bow to that ruling, none of the corporations would. Get up and get yourselves together. The trails continue up that way. It looks like they go all the way into Tunnel 4, Buckard said. Yeah, bodies, the crewmen's corpses or whatever's left and isn't strung across the floor. Telos told him. Think about that for a minute. We need to leave. Those men trusted us, damn it. Buckard retorted stubbornly, we aren't leaving until we see the monsters that did this. Look, I agree with Telos on this one. Even if we find them, there's no way the company will allow them to live. What's the point of saving them just so they can be executed? That's worse than leaving them to die here. Saff replied, doing his best to be the voice of reason. If we spin it right, we could get a nice promotion and raise. Or we die with the rest of them. Those are our choices, Telos said, his face as grim as his words. Then we're just as guilty in the eyes of the council, Buckard told him, apparently feeling guilty for even considering abandoning the freelancers. But we would be made men. No more salvagers jobs. We'd have office gigs on a decent planet. Besides, if we leave now, the council will never find out about this. I'm sure as hell not going to blow the whistle, Saff said, feeling awful for every word that fell out of his mouth. At this point, he would say anything to get out of these damn tunnels. That's a little mercenary of you, new guy, Buckard said to him. Besides, if the crews came across sentient life, you know damn well they'd know enough to keep their mouths shut. If the OZA was so afraid of that, they wouldn't have sent us here in the first place. You two need to remember that, Buckard said, walking towards the start of the trail. They fell in behind him, Saff first and then Telos. Neither of them liked the idea of making their way back alone. The trail of gore led them to the intersection that divided the tunnels. It took a sharp right down into Tunnel 4. Right where Team 4 had gone dark. Whatever lived here apparently lived in Tunnel 4. Saff remembered it was where the troubleshooters and several miners went missing too, from what he could glean from those reports. No bodies recovered. That incident had been written up as a cave-in. Looking at the expanse that lay before him, he knew that wasn't the case. Buckard turned to them. From the look on his face, Saff could tell he also remembered those incident reports they had read in the control room. "Stay close," was all he said before turning back around and walking into the mouth of the tunnel. Saff and Telos had no choice but to follow. 6. The lighting along the tunnel got dim and faded out, making it harder to make out the drag marks they were following. Buckard ordered them to use the small lights attached to their vests. They emitted a bright blue light that was supposed to be softer on the eyes when working in the often poorly lit tunnels. Clicking it twice would change the light to red so that it would be harder for anyone to see them from a distance. For scavenging it was just so you didn't accidentally temporarily blind someone when turning a corner and making it easier to make out certain things in low light conditions. Buckard signaled them to stop and click their lights a second time, just another reminder of the dire situation they now found themselves in. Since Saff knew they weren't doing it for safety reasons like he'd learned in training, this time it was so whatever enemy they were up against wouldn't be able to see them coming. Not that he thought that would matter. Whatever or whoever was down here had easily taken out 4 mining teams. He didn't see how 3 men were supposed to stop them. They heard the sound of what could only be described by a loud, repetitive clicking sound. It sounded like thousands of demonic crickets chirping from a distance. When they saw where it was coming from, they stopped short. The trio found themselves in a circular chamber. In the center of it was a giant hole, and from it emanated the strange clicking sound. The hole was larger than all 3 of them put together. The drag marks disappeared into its depth, red streaks sliding into the mouth of the chasm. If he had to guess, Saff would bet they continued down the side of the hole and lead to wherever it ended. Any thoughts he had that something human had done this were immediately dashed from his mind. Nothing human could scale something like this, especially not while dragging a body. As Buckard began walking closer to the hole, Telos's hand shot out and stopped him dead in his tracks. Before Buckard even had a chance to swear at the other man, Telos pointed above them. His face was pale with fear even in the dim red light. Saff followed the direction he was looking in. At first he saw nothing, his light simply shining off the wall. That's when he realized that it wasn't the wall that was reflecting his light, but the hard, glossy shells of hundreds of large insect-like creatures that were covering the walls and the ceiling. They had been paying so much attention to the drag marks, they hadn't paid attention to their surroundings, and it looked like they were about to pay for their mistake. Buckard looked like he might be sick. They all backed out slowly, step by step, carefully trying to ensure that they didn't make any sounds that could rouse the slumbering creatures. Telos's heel clipped a rock, sending it clattering into the wall. The sound seemed to be much louder than it was echoing around the tunnel. They froze. Beads of sweat covered their brows as panic set in. Saff swore he could hear everyone's hearts as they pounded in their chests. Even that noise, he thought, could be enough to wake these creatures. If that happened, Saff knew in his mind that they'd share the missing team's grisly fates. They moved again, even more slowly this time. As they attempted to put as much distance between themselves and the creatures as possible. A sound reverberated from the hole in front of them, a low gnashing sound that grated hard against their ears. Like rocks grinding against a chalkboard. Or very large teeth grinding together, Saff thought miserably. The sound seemed to wake the creatures, and they scuttled, their many legs wriggling, prying them free of their perch. For now, it seemed they had yet to notice the trio as they crawled over each other, reminding Saff of a mound of earwigs. Saff wanted to scream at the sight, and Telos looked like he might. Buckard was already moving again, not wasting any time looking at the things. The creatures started slowly moving from side to side, as if shaking themselves awake. Every little movement set the trio's nerves on edge as they continued their slow retreat to the tunnel's entrance. Suddenly, without warning, the creatures dropped from the ceiling and moved down from the walls facing their direction. A sea of them, and moving in their direction. From their insect-like mouths came a loud screech as they charged towards Saff and the others. Buckard turned and ran just like that. Saff and Telos followed his lead. Foregoing the need for silence, they ran as hard as they could. The tunnel was filled with the screeching sounds as the swarm hunted them through the tunnels. Saff could hear them behind him. Not the plodding sounds of boots or feet, but the quick clacks of arthropod legs as they rebounded off the hard-packed tunnel floors, propelling the carnivorous monsters faster and faster after them. He would have screamed then, but that would have exerted too much energy. Energy that was better used in extending his legs. Telos laughed loudly. A crazy, pleading laugh. Wasn't this just his luck? Telos thought. He could have turned back, he had been given the option, but no, he had let loyalty blind him. Now he was going to get eaten by some species of giant ants. No good deed goes unpunished, after all. Saff only stared at him, hoping that the other man hadn't lost his mind. Now they would rush him if he didn't run faster. They were getting closer, and he figured that if one of them got a hold of him, the others would pile on as well. What the hell are these things? Telos wondered. They didn't move like ants, though. He couldn't help but think, as he ran for his life. Ants seem to move in a straight line, whereas these things move in an almost serpentine motion, their bodies twisting side to side as their dagger-like legs clicked off the ground. The worst part was their mouths. Unlike ants, they were not pincer-like, and instead they were made up of long curved mandibles to pull in prey, followed by almost worm-like mouths with rows and rows of teeth in which to devour them. No, Telos swore, these were certainly not ants. Bukkard was huffing, running as fast as he could, trying to make it back to the lift. He'd started good, opening his legs for maximum stride, just like he'd been taught back when he was a corporate soldier, but he was no longer a young man. And as such, he hadn't been keeping himself in the best of shape as the years had gone by. He could hear them behind him, Saff's easy strides and Telos's swearing, and the other sound, the sound of clattering legs and hungry mouths quickly gaining on them. That sound was more than enough motivation for him to keep his legs pumping. That sound helped him push past the burning he felt in his legs and chest. If he could make it to the lift and hold it open long enough, then they could all make it off this stupid rock. The company be damned, OZA would firebomb this world anyhow once they didn't check in. Hell, if they all made it and kept quiet, OZA would probably pay them off. Hopefully. Buckard found himself at the crossroads and shot down Tunnel 1, huffing and puffing as he went. He aimed his rifle down the tunnel, hoping to buy the others time, but it wouldn't work. There were too many, and they were too fast. By the time he aimed and fired, they'd be on him. Saff and Telos were running next to each other as the things skittered behind them. They ran up walls and started to try to lunge at them, their bodies falling into the swarming mass of black forms behind them, rising again after every failed attempt to give chase. They wouldn't make it to Tunnel 1. There was no way. With each lunge, these things got closer. Tireless and unrelenting, the creatures just kept coming. As the crossroads loomed in front of them, Saff took a hard turn and instead hurried down Tunnel 3. His last sight of Telos was as the other man dove into Tunnel 2. Their only plan was survival, as the swarm behind them had simply split 3 ways, quickly dividing itself up to give chase to all 3 men. Like a wave breaking against a rock, the tide of shiny black bodies broke off into 3 streams, storming down the tunnels. 7. There was nothing Bukkard could do, as Saff and Telos went down the other 2 tunnels and out of his reach. All of them splitting up to avoid the horde of monstrous aliens wasn't the plan he'd choose, and he didn't know if it would actually help or if it would just buy them a few more minutes of life. Their fates were their own, but he would do his best to get them help if he found a way out. If not, then he hoped they took a lot of the bastards with them. Whatever happened, he wouldn't leave them behind if he could help it. However, with the horde descending upon him, he doubted he'd have the opportunity to help them, or himself for that matter. Cold realization sank in and filled the pit of his stomach with ice. They were all going to die here, completely outnumbered. No one would even know what happened to them. Buckard pushed those feelings down. He needed to stay focused. Fear could kill just as quickly as those monsters behind him. He'd seen it happen firsthand during the war. If he was going down, he was going down fighting. He could see the lift, but it wasn't automated, not like the ones on the ship. The minute it would take to stop and press the button, they would be on him with a wriggling throng of hungry mouths. Already, he could hear as Tunnel 1 was suddenly filled with the wriggling bodies of the creatures hunting him. That's when he remembered the side room off to his right that was welded shut. Never slowing down as he ran, Buckard opened fire on the door. The metal caved under the heavy rifle rounds as the creatures turned the corner and began to push further into Tunnel 1. At least, this would let him keep his back to a wall. If they couldn't get behind him, maybe he would have a fighting chance to send as many of those creatures back to whatever unnamed hell they came from before they tore him apart. Buckard swiveled in the doorway, opening fire on his pursuers. Their bodies erupted in gore as the rifle rounds ripped through their hard shell-like bodies and pulverized the soft meat underneath, each shot showering the walls in dark alien blood. The survivors scuttled for cover. Apparently, they were familiar with the effects of gunfire. That solves the mystery of the missing troubleshooters. Buckard thought grimly as he backed farther into the small room. He cursed as his back foot slipped, and instead of coming into contact with a wall, found a large opening. Glancing back without lowering his rifle, he saw a large hole in the back wall. Whatever had made it was bigger than any man. Bigger than those things out there. The hole seemed to go straight back and then down. The large bug-like creatures made a high keening sound from behind their cover. It differed from the earlier screech and even the clicking sound he had heard them make. They were communicating. The thought chilled Buckard to his core. If they could communicate, they could strategize. One coordinated rush, and he wouldn't have a chance. They could bum rush him again and again, until he ran out of ammo. Natural selection at its finest. Trapped between certain death and whatever lay on the other side of the hole, Buckard cursed loudly and walked backwards into the darkness, hoping whatever originally made it was long gone. He didn't have to walk long before finding out that it was a straight drop. Buckard experienced the same sensation as when a ship came out of orbit and hit escape velocity. Except instead of being safely strapped in, he was on a child's slide from hell. For all he knew, the only thing on the other side was another monstrous mouth waiting to eat him. As he fell, he pulled his knees to his chest, placing his rifle so it was aiming between his feet. He planned on being hard to swallow. The darkness gave way to hard ground, and Buckard fell in a heap on the ground, his rifle clattering a couple feet away from him. He was lying on the well-packed dirt that littered the rougher tunnels, but he was several stories down from the look of it. The chamber he was in was filled with natural light, so he clicked off his chest light to save the charge. Looking around, he found the light source. Luminous crystals dotted the cavern walls and ceiling, providing more light than the fluorescent ones that ran on electricity in the tunnels above and were easier on the eyes. It's a shame the company didn't mine these things and sell them. They would have made a killing on some of the colony worlds, where electricity was shoddy at best. If he wasn't in such a dire situation, he would have filled up a whole bag full of those things. Now, that would have been a hell of a bonus. He moved along the pathway, which was larger than those above. Following the trail of crystal lights, he noticed a fetid, musky smell that filled the tunnel. The deeper along he went, the heavier it got. By the time he came to the large open area at the end of the path, he had to pull a rag out of his pocket and tie around his mouth and nose, but even that wasn't enough to block the smell. The large open area was strange. The crystal lights still emitted their warm glow, but in the room it seemed to take on a greenish pallor. The room he now found himself in was wide and with a high ceiling, 40 feet or higher by Buckard estimation. But what really drew his attention was that the room was littered with giant clumps of a gooey substance. Mounds and mounds of them. Buckard had a bad feeling about the chamber he now stood in. Bringing his rifle up high on his shoulder, he advanced towards the nearest clump. It was roughly as large as he was, but shaped like an oval. He kicked it, jumping back when it moved. What the hell? He thought. The clump began to wiggle and shake. Buckard wondered if he shouldn't just blow a hole in it to be on the safe side, but stopped when two pale white hands tore themselves free of the mass. The hands were followed by arms and then shoulders. Still aiming at the mass, Buckard watched in sick fascination as the head suddenly emerged, coughing and sputtering. The man looked oddly familiar. That's it, Buckard thought. He was with one of the crews, John or Jim, something like that. After signing them on to the crew, Buckard hadn't really taken the time to learn their names. After all, once the job was finished, he would have seen none of the independents again. "What happened to you?" Buckard asked him. His finger tensed on the trigger. If the man so much as breathed wrong, it would be the last thing he did. Buckard had taken enough chances for one day. The man looked like he was in shock. He kept grabbing at his shoulder. It looked like something had taken a chunk out of it. His eyes had a wild, panicked look in them as he pulled himself from the clump. He looked like he was going to answer Buckard's question, but when he opened his mouth to speak, he began vomiting the dark green goo. Buckard backed up and looked away as the man was getting sick, watching him out of his peripheral vision just to be safe. After a few moments, the man stopped retching and took a few hard, ragged breaths. "I don't know," he replied. "Something grabbed me out of a closet in Tunnel 1. Buckard turned back to him. "You were the guy who welded the door shut. What's your name?" The man got to his feet slowly. "John, my name's John. I don't know how I got down here. The last thing I remember is this thing grabbing me. It bit my shoulder, and then everything went black." The panicked look returned. "It was awful," he said, barely loud enough for Buckard to hear. Buckard shook his head. John looked like he was going to drop any minute. The wise thing would be to cut his losses and put the other man out of his misery, but Buckard just couldn't bring himself to do it. Just because the company could make hard calls concerning human life didn't mean he had to. "Okay, we can go back the way I came. The tunnel went two ways. Grab a couple of those crystals. The other tunnel was darker than this one, and we don't need any more surprises jumping out at us." John, favoring his uninjured side, followed Buckard's orders, and they headed off, back down the tunnel. 8. Telos kept running, slowing down only long enough to fire wild potshots behind him. He heard a couple of loud screeching sounds, letting him know that some of them found a target. Not stopping long enough to see if he had killed any of them or not, he kept running, doing his best to stay ahead of the hungry horde. He should have tried to make it down Tunnel 1. That way he would have had a chance at escape or stayed with Saff. He told himself angrily. At least then they could have figured out a plan together. The things behind him were relentless. He wished in vain that he had studied the maps better. If he was lucky, Tunnel 2 would wrap around at some point into one of the other tunnels. If he wasn't, it would dive straight down to a dead end. He hoped it would wrap around, but he hadn't been very lucky today. Up ahead of him, Telos saw something that almost made him jump in sheer joy. A guard outpost carved into the side of the tunnel with one great sliding steel door. It was off to the left, directly in front of him. This must have been one of the areas they had stationed the troubleshooters that Saff was talking about. That way, they could keep a watchful eye on Tunnel 4 and still be out of the way of the miners. The company must have known about the creatures and sent them here anyway. If he made it out of this, Telos swore to himself that he would never again do another salvage mission. It was boring, safe desk work from here on out. Preferably on one of those pleasure planets where people went on vacation. He'd take any job that got him out of this. No matter how low or underpaid. As long as he was far from here, Telos didn't care. He slid to a stop in front of the heavy metal guard door. Turning around, he fired his pistol as fast as he could, sending singing laser beams into the mass of creatures chasing him. They screeched and scrambled away from each other under the barrage. He walked into the guard post and sealed the door shut. The hiss of the locks settling into place was reassuring. But just for his own peace of mind, he cranked the lever on the side of the door, which made 4 heavy metal bars lock into place. There was no chance they were getting in here. They could ram themselves against the door for as long as they wanted, and it wouldn't even so much as bend. Telos looked around at the dull metal walls, floors, and ceiling. OZA standard and nay impenetrable. One way in and one way out. He slumped heavily into the control station. It looked the same as the one from the command room above ground. Hopefully, the communicator relay would allow him to contact his team directly. If they were still alive. The creatures outside rammed the door a couple of times and then gave up. Knowing the troubleshooters, this tiny station had probably been built specifically to defend against those things outside. The company never left anything to chance, and if half the stories about the legendary troubleshooter regiments were true, neither did they. Telos took a moment from punching in the communicator codes for Buckard's and Saff's individual communicators into the built-in communication station to take an inventory of the post. There were several weapons lockers against the walls. It looked there were a couple of rifles and shotguns and ammunition crates for each. A small bunk was tucked into one corner with several food crates full of ready-to-eat, dried meals and a doorway that contained a small bathroom on the other side. This place had designed this to survive under a siege, which meant they designed it specifically in case those creatures got loose. This was so far above all of their pay grades, it wasn't even funny. The fact that a single guard station was this well armed wasn't exactly good news. Something really awful had taken place long before they got here, and he doubted the company would be happy they stumbled upon it. At least I won't starve to death, Telos realized, taking no pleasure in the thought of being trapped here for an extended period. The thought brought him little comfort as he palmed several fragmentary grenades and brought them to the little control desk. The communicator relay clicked in on Buckard's signal, but would not show his current location, which either meant the signal was weak or he wasn't on a known path. Telos tried to raise him on comms. He wished the guard's monitor station could do more to show the other Mont's position. "Buckard, come in," he said into the large protruding microphone. Outdated technology, for sure. There was a long pause. Telos had almost given up when Buckard's voice finally came through over layers of static. "Telos, is that you?" Buckard asked. "Yeah, there was a guard station in Tunnel 2. Since I can't ping your signal on the monitor, I take it you're not topside?" he asked. "No such luck. I fell into a hole. Look, I found one miner still alive. Those creatures had him in some type of cocoon." Buckard clicked back. Telos gritted his teeth. The message was simple. "Whatever you do, don't get taken alive." Telos had to strain to hear the rest of Buckard's message because it was so full of static. The thought of being cocooned and saved for later made him sick just thinking about it, and added another strain to his already worried mind. "Where are you now?" Telos buzzed. The silence inside the guard station was deafening as he nervously waited for a reply. Telos found he was suddenly too hot and stripped down from his work jacket with its loose armor which was woven into it to the thin t-shirt beneath. He drank several cups of water from the sink while he waited. All the water he could ever wish for. Who would have thought he would have to be in a back-world hell to live the high life? Just then, the communicator clicked back on. 2. Deep. Can't make out all. Continue to surface. Buckard's voice echoed, then the communicator lost the frequency. Wherever he was, it was drastically affecting his communicator. The message was clear enough, though Buckard would do his best to make it above ground. There wasn't going to be any heroic rescues in store. It seemed at the moment it was every man for himself. The device still hadn't located Saff, which could mean anything. But Saff should be the closest to his position, and if he could make contact, the two of them might just be able to get off this rock. The blinking red light turned to green. It had Saff locked in. Took it long enough, swore Telos, unable to understand how this place had functioned with such outdated tech as a blip on the screen showed him Saff's position. He was running hard and fast up Tunnel 3. At least that's what it looked like, since the dot that represented him seemed to move so erratically. The monitor only showed him when it could ping his communicator. If anything interfered with that, Saff's dot would blink off the screen and then back on. At least if it was moving, he knew Saff was alive. Unless those things are carrying him off. For the first time in his life, Telos wished he wasn't such a pessimist. "Saff, come in." He tried again. The only answer to his attempts at communication was silence. If he was being chased, there was little chance he would take the time to make a reply. And if he stopped moving on the screen, there would be a good chance that he was dead. Without contact from either Saff or Buckard, Telos feared the worst. He didn't like the idea of trying to leave this place by himself. Using the control panel to see what all he could access from here, he made a startling discovery. From this control panel, he could also access the explosives that the mining crews had brought in. Using their detonation codes, he could set a countdown to send them. Where those explosives actually got placed was anyone's guess. But one thing was for sure, if they all went off, most of these tunnels were coming down. Now he just needed to figure out a way out of here before he punched them in, because he really didn't want this place to become his tomb. Telos. Telos, come in. Saff's voice cracked over the communicator and filled the guard station. Telos almost whooped for joy. 9. The lights in Tunnel 3 flickered. The side walls seemed to get closer together as Saff ran down its well-packed dirt path. The creatures behind him had tried to rush ahead as the tunnel narrowed, which led them to trip over each other, giving Saff an extra bout of motivation to push ahead. He couldn't stop running, knowing if he did and really looked at what was chasing him, his fear would get him killed. His communicator clicked, and he heard Telos's voice come across, hailing him. He almost dropped his pistol, trying to send a reply. Damn, he thought, fumbling for the gun. If he lost that, he was screwed. He hoped against all hope that Telos had made it to the surface. Maybe if they were lucky, he had sent out a distress signal. The only question would be whether they would come to rescue them or to kill them. The communicator went off again. This time, both Telos and Buckard, he listened closely to what they said, but didn't stop moving. Their words swiftly dashed his dreams of rescue. Damn, Saff thought. They were all trapped, and none of them had sounded an alarm on the way down. Which meant corporate wouldn't come looking for them until they missed their next check-in. And even then, it would take a while for them to send a team out. Most scavenger teams were given a grace period with check-ins, since conditions in open space could change rapidly, especially in highly trafficked lanes. The narrowing passage came to a sudden stop. The only thing in front of him was a lift much like the one in Tunnel 1. Saff felt the sweat running down his back as he made his way into the lift. The only alternative would be to fight it out with the creatures behind him. No, he shook the thought out of his head as he swiftly looked back at the multitude of teeming bodies behind him. That would be suicide, plain and simple. With no other choices, he took his chances with the lift. The creatures rounded the corner as the lift gates shut, and Saff was propelled deeper and deeper into the ground. Saff was plunged into complete darkness as the lights inside the lift struggled to switch on. With a dull mechanical groan he could barely hear over his beating heart, the lights above Saff finally whined to life. They flooded the lift and the shaft below, in a harsh fluorescent light that felt like it was going to burn out his retinas. This tunnel wasn't on the map. At least not the map that they were given, and not the one displayed in the command room on the surface. It showed Tunnel 3 as a loop around, which was the reason Saff had thought himself safe for running down it. His tired legs finally gave out, and he slid down the side of the lift. Saff didn't realize how tired he was until he was laying spread eagle on the floor. Wherever this was taking him, it was deep. His heart was still thudding in his chest, and his breathing became steadier as his body finally realized it was no longer fleeing for its life. Clicking the communicator, Saff tried to send a message to Telos. Only empty static answered him. The tunnel he was descending into must be outside of the communicator's range. Leave it to OZA to equip them with communicators that barely worked inside the actual mines they were supposed to work for. Sitting up, Saff checked his pistol, making sure the laser still had enough charge. He had fired several shots off at the creatures on his flight to the lift. The pistol still showed it was at 85% charge. Enough to give him a fighting chance. The lift came to a grating halt at the bottom of the shaft. The doors slid open slowly with a screeching sound that threatened to send Saff jumping out of his skin. He held the pistol out in front of him with shaking hands and taking cautious steps, he exited the lift. The lights overhead flickered, as if at any moment they would suddenly die. Ominous, he thought as he moved deeper into the tunnel. Unlike the tunnels above, this tunnel had metal walls and floors, more like an entry tunnel than anything else. As Saff moved slowly down the dimly lit area, he noticed that there were several doors and some windowed areas. An almost identical twin of the cafeteria in Tunnel 1, but what was most disturbing was what seemed to be a complete rendition of a command room. Exactly like the one upstairs. Except with better equipment. After 3 years with OZA Corporation, he had never seen them put a control room underground. They were always above ground, in the case of emergency demolition or evacuation. He hoped Buckard was okay, and they all made it out alive so that he could ask the older employee about what he had found. Whatever they were doing down here, they didn't want anyone to know about, that's for sure. Going to the cafeteria, he found it mostly cleaned out. There were, however, a couple of thermoses of water that he drank heavily from. Without a personal filter, Saff didn't trust drinking the running water this far below ground. Who knows what kind of heavy metals and radiation might be in it. Sitting at one of the round tables in the mess area, he helped himself to a ready-to-eat meal that he snagged from the pantry closet. It didn't taste like anything he could describe and was a little too chewy, one hell of a final meal. From the size of this area, it looked like a large team probably worked down here at one point. Doing what, Saff didn't know, although he doubted they were mining with the walls closed off like that. He soon found his answer inside the command room. On the wall was a diagram. It showed one of those creatures. Except it was different. This one was wearing a sort of collar around what could be described as its neck. The diagram was labeled Uero's harness. So that's what they were called, Ueros. The other rooms must be labs, he realized, with a barely suppressed shudder. They had been trying to control them. No wonder there had been no pleasure rooms. The thought shook Saff. If they were using the Ueros for the deeper operations, they could have run this place on a skeleton crew. What were they up to down here? And more importantly, what went wrong? He didn't have time to dwell on it, though. More than anything, he wanted to go into the labs and look it over. But what would he do if the Ueros were in there waiting? Surely, whatever went wrong on this backwater planet must have started here. In the corner of the office, he found the next best thing. A data terminal. He took his pack off his back and started doing a data transfer. He had a feeling that this information was worth far more than anything on the surface. With this, he might be able to bargain for their lives. Or at least die with some answers. With a groan, he knew that he still wasn't safe, not by a long shot. Unless he could find a way back to the surface, he would die down here, one way or the other. After the transfer was complete, he went to the communications terminal. He switched on the inboard communicator and was delighted to hear the low buzzing sound that let him know it was working. He laughed when he saw the bulky microphone sticking out of it. Telos. Telos, this is Saff. He said quickly into the microphone. Telos replied after a few minutes. Saff explained his current situation. Like Telos, they were both trapped. Able to eat and drink, but it would only be a matter of time before those things found a way in. After all, in the end, Mine-198 had been abandoned, closed, and slotted for demolition. They knew OZA Corporation wouldn't think twice about making this place their tombs if necessary. Have you heard anything more from Buckard? Saff asked him. The communicator was silent for a little while. A weary-sounding telos clicked back on. No. I have heard nothing back from him in over an hour now. Perhaps he is just too far out of range, Saff replied, trying to convince himself as much as Telos. Yeah, maybe, was the only reply, leaving both men alone with their thoughts. 10. Bukkard was terrified. He'd never experienced fear like this before, at any other point in his career, as either a salvager or a soldier. More afraid than he had been in the trenches of Terra IV, dodging GYNZO machine gun and artillery fire. At least that was an enemy he'd understood. But these things were monsters. He thought, unable to find a better word for the creatures. He now found himself in a long dark tunnel with no hope of rescue, and with a survivor that couldn't and shouldn't be trusted to watch his back. The way John fidgeted and jumped around made Buckard wary. He couldn't understand why John was cocooned while the others were not. What made this man more special than the other miners? There were other cocoons, but none of them had moved, and Buckard doubted that they were alive still. Buckard was tough, but even he didn't have the stomach to open up the other cocoons. He hadn't wanted to see what was left inside. As they walked through the tunnel, it became more and more humid. Both men began to sweat profusely, which only added to their already dangerous as it increased their chances of dehydration. Their lack of water was troubling him, however, and Buckard wasn't going to announce to John that he still carried a small canteen. John looked like he might keel over any minute, and there was no reason to waste water. The humidity clung to them like a jacket, and the smell only seemed to get worse. Buckard could only compare it to walking into a sauna filled with rotten eggs. Buckard's rifle was out in front of them, constantly sweeping back and forth as they made their way up the tunnel. He was afraid of what they were going to find next. Both men jumped at every shadow, afraid of the dangers that might hide in it. They heard the clacking and the chattering of the creatures, but they never saw them. It always sounded like they were just up ahead, but the tunnel seemed to stretch forever. They came to a wide area that seemed to be the source of the smell. What Buckard saw down there took his breath away. He knew that as long as he lived, he would never forget the sight. It was terrible to behold. They found themselves in a large shaft-like room that went straight up and straight down. The only word that Buckard could find that described it was a hive. With tunnels coming out in all directions, he could see the creatures below them moving cocoons like he had found John into an even larger beast. And these cocoons were wiggling. Guess John was so special after all. Buckard knew then that he would never make it out of here, and from the low moan that John made, he must have come to the same conclusion. At the bottom of the hive where the creatures laid out the cocoons, Buckard got the answer to why they were cocooned at all. It was one of the creatures. At least it looked passing like them. It was the size of some of a small dropship, but its legs were barely big enough to support itself, leaving only able to drag its massive abdomen around the bottom of the hive. Which was why the others were carrying food to it, he realized. Food that it devoured voraciously. The beast was able to swallow the cocooned whole, using a strange gyrating motion with its mouth mandibles. Its many rows of teeth, helping to pull the cocoons farther and farther down its throat. They stood there watching in horror, as some cocoons began to emit very human screams as the creature's teeth tore into them, and it swallowed them whole. Buckard had often said the war was hell, but this was hell. He would prefer to be back in the trenches right now, than in the hive. Anything would be better than this. We're going to die here. There's no way out of this place. John wept. Buckard felt his temper flare, and he had to restrain himself from striking the other man. He had never had any use for quitters. He grabbed Buckard's jacket, or at least tried to, before Buckard pushed him roughly back against the wall. Pull yourself together, man. The last thing we need is for you to tip off those things that were up here, because then you would be right. We will die. And we will die bad. You can do what you want, but I'm doing my best to make sure that I don't become food for that fucking thing down there. Buckard felt sorry for the other man as he turned his back to let him collect himself. John wiped the tears out of his eyes, taking deep breaths to try to settle down as best he could. They started moving then around the hive, trying to make their way to one of the smaller tunnels, a tunnel they hoped would take them back up to tunnel number 4. Or any connecting surface tunnels. If anything, he thought to himself, it was more likely that whatever tunnel they picked would take them right to the mouth that thing down there. Right into the jaws of the beast. As they made their way into the tunnel off to the right, the entire tunnel system filled with a loud, high keening sound that made both men drop to their knees and clutch their ears as it echoed throughout the whole hive. What is that? John yelled as both men writhed on the ground in pain. Their eardrums threatened to burst from the onslaught. And as suddenly as it came, it stopped. They peered over the edge then, to where the gigantic creature whom Buckard decided must be their queen had screeched, and looking down at it, they almost wished that it was still making a sound. For this giant creature was now staring directly at them, and so were all its attendants. A clattering sound filled the hive, a sound that both men knew to be a warning system, letting every one of those creatures know that there were now intruders in the hive. John seemed like he was about to say something, but he must have come to the same conclusion as his words turned into a muffled sob instead. Buckard grabbed him roughly and pulled him towards the tunnel entrance because behind them, the bugs were climbing up the side of the hive, making their way to where the intruders were. And even worse was the sound from other tunnels, the clattering of large forelegs as they made their way on the hard-packed earth. The thought of their black, hard-shelled forearms and rows of worm-like teeth was all the motivation that Buckard needed to push forward even faster, dragging John behind him every step of the way. He knew that the only thing keeping them alive right now was running, and eventually even that would come to a halt, especially with John tripping and threatening to go into shock. Buckard, no matter how tempted he was to leave the other man behind, kept dragging him along. The OZA didn't believe in their soldiers abandoning one another, and after the war, Buckard had taken that notion with him as a salvager. If he was going to die here today, he was damn well going to do it with his honor intact. They made it to the next tunnel, hopefully their salvation. Buckard looked behind him and immediately wished he hadn't. It was already filling quickly, as the creatures literally tripped over each other to get at them. John finally seemed to shake off his earlier fright, or perhaps seeing the creatures behind them startled him into action. For now, he kept an even pace with the Buckard as they ran along the quickly ascending tunnel. 11. Telos and Saff had finally come to a decision. Telos just hoped they weren't making the wrong one, because if so, neither man was going to make it off this rock. As long as the timing was right. Telos would dial in the detonation codes, with a 2-hour delay. But with no way to track the exact time once he left the guard station, they would have to haul ass as soon as the clock began clicking down. And hopefully, they would all be able to watch Mine-198 fall in on itself from the orbit. Although either way, he thought mused the mine would be no more. And neither would most of those creatures. U-arrows, or whatever Saff called them. Yeah, a nice cushy desk job, he said to himself as he started racking rounds into one of the old shotguns he had picked up and strapped 2 more laser pistols to himself. And with a forlorn look, he grabbed 6 of the grenades and put them on his belt. They were to be his last line of defense. That way, he thought, if I don't make it, I can at least take some of them with me and not have to worry about being eaten alive. It was a grim thought, but the alternative was much worse. He didn't want his parts strewn across one of the tunnels. That was for sure. Telos's fingers trembled on the control board as he put in the codes that would arm the explosives. Once he walked out of those doors, there would be no stopping the blast whether they made it to the lift or not. OZA Corporation had definitely screwed them on this one. He thought they had screwed Saff even more, since they had left no maps of how to get to the surface from the secret compound he now found himself in. Unless he used the lift, but those things would probably wait for him at the top. The control panel began the countdown, 2 hours locked in, 1 hour and 59 minutes remaining. Time to get moving. Telos took a deep breath of air as he headed toward the large metal door. The only thing that separated him from the creatures outside. He racked a shell into the shotgun and switched off the safety. He flipped the lever, watching as the metal bars retracted. Then he pressed the button to open the door. With a small grinding sound, the door opened. There were none of the creatures in sight. Telos almost gave a whoop of excitement as he saw the empty cavern in front of him, even popping his head out and looking upwards. He could see the pathway that he had just run down not too long ago now stood clear. But instead of charging blindly ahead, he stilled himself and creeped out the doorway carefully, afraid that any loud sounds or quick movements would bring the creatures scuttling back in his direction. He made his way cautiously up the tunnel. The shotgun felt strange and heavy in his arms. He thought having such a big weapon would have at least made him feel safe against his current threats, But now, more than anything, he was afraid that he might actually have to use it. They had been trained with them. All salvagers had to be, but they never actually had to use them, and it had been years since he had issued one at a range. The last time he had fired even a laser pistol before today was that incident with the dog, which Buckard had never let him forget. The only one of them who had experience with this sort of thing was Buckard. The man had been a soldier in the corporate wars and had even fought in some of the colony uprisings before becoming a salvager. He was a legend in some circles. Too bad he isn't here with me now, Telos swore. He hoped the old man would make it off this rock too. For the millionth time, Telos found that he desperately wanted the man here now with him. His hard advice would have helped to calm Telos's nerves, or at least made him feel surer of himself. He came to a complete halt, standing stock still and raising the shotgun to his shoulder. He took a shaky swallow and tried to push back his fear as his eyes locked onto several of the creatures in front of him. They seemed to be sleeping, if that was possible, or perhaps the more likely, he thought, they were lying in wait for him, just like they had been doing in Tunnel 4. He assumed the creatures were smarter than just mere animals. They knew that the tunnel was his only route of escape. He cursed himself then. Getting overly paranoid would not help them in this situation. He willed his finger to be still on the trigger, trying to remember his training. He pulled his shoulder tight around the butt of the shotgun, holding it tight with both hands. That way, the recoil wouldn't send it flying from his arms. He took 2 more steps cautiously towards the creatures. He took careful aim at the bigger of the bunch, looking for breaking its armored body. Telos took a deep breath and squeezed. The tunnel was filled with a loud roar, as black goo painted the tunnel wall, and the creature was ripped apart by the spreading pellets. The shotgun did its work quickly. Telos's shoulder flared with pain as it bucked back into him, but he knew that he couldn't take the time to feel it. So when the gun jerked back, he jerked forward, quickly racking another round into it, firing again at the creatures in front of him, whom he seemed to have just caught off guard. They didn't stand a chance. 7 of the beasts lay dead in front of him, with others injured. As he ran away from them and up the tunnel back to the crossroads, he could hear the surviving creatures give chase and emit that high-pitched keening noise to signal the others. Running, Telos dug into his pockets, finding more shells for the shotgun. As Telos reloaded, he realized he no longer felt the pain in his shoulder, but he welcomed it. He decided then, no matter what he had to do, he was going to survive. Telos pumped his legs as fast as he could, doing his best to keep the gun ready in front of him. Damn, he thought, I really should have paid more attention to the weapons readiness classes that the corporation was always drilling into us. He had figured that it would be something he would never need. The light from the crossroads suddenly rose to meet him. And with dismay, Telos watched as it filled with the bodies of the creatures as they bore down upon him. Without slowing down, he leveled the shotgun and charged. 12. Bukkard and John's flight to freedom came to a quick stop as they found themselves surrounded in all directions by the savage creatures. They can be herding them back towards the Queen's chamber. They came at John and him from all directions. No creature pounced in any way that could take them down. Instead, they were herded down tunnels, taking them lower and lower into the hive. Scores of them lay dead along the tunnels, making tall piles along the tunnel sides. Although now any visions of them blasting away out of the hive had long since been crushed. He noted his remaining rifle rounds. If they weren't going to kill them, there was no sense in him wasting the rounds. Those, Buckard thought, would be his and John's one-way ticket out of here. Better to go on your own terms than to wind up in the belly of those things. John was blubbering as he threw rocks at the creatures. Some shrieked when hit, but none of them died. The only good he was doing was to piss them off. Whatever helped him cope with the situation, Buckard thought to himself, as they were once again herded like animals back down another tunnel. The smell became worse, letting them know they were getting closer and closer to the Queen. They rapidly descended. The creatures now filled the tunnel in front of them. A veritable swarm of them. Their way of letting them know that there was no escape, Buckard thought. Below, they could hear a deep rumbling sound. The queen was apparently expecting their arrival. They would be gobbled up, Buckard thought to himself. It's probably waiting for them right outside the mouth of the cave, with her jaws wide open. Buckard steeled himself for the encounter. He had 1 magazine left for his rifle, 30 rounds left, 29 for them, 1 for him. He could hear something large behind them. They knew without turning around, they were in the cavern of the queen. The rest of the creatures halted at the mouth of the cave, apparently awaiting some signal from their queen, but they also cut off any chance of escape that Buckard could have conceived. Only one way out here, he thought. All those years of fighting and surviving, just to end up here. It was fitting, in a way. He couldn't help but think, as he stared at the queen. The creature looked down at them, its many eyes glittering in the light of the stones. Buckard grinned and laughed. At least it would be a good death. Beside him, John was mumbling as he picked up several rocks and beamed them at some larger creatures off to the side of the queen. They were almost similar to the ones that were chasing them down the hallways, except these had almost arm-like appendages on the front and a couple and more serpentine-like bodies, probably making it easier for them to navigate tight tunnels. The ones with the normal centipede-like legs were the ones they had seen feed the queen her victims. John screamed obscenities as he hurled any rocks and stones he could find at the creatures acting as Buckard's backup. The man was fighting, trapped on all sides by the creatures. Buckard found himself actually proud of the cowardly man. John's rock smashed one creature in the face and bounced harmlessly off the hard body armor of the other ones. The larger ones clapped their mandibles together and emit a low whistling sound. A sound reminded Buckard of a tea kettle. The sound shook him to the bone. The other smaller creatures that had been surrounding them pounded their legs into the dirt, like spectators clapping at a coliseum. John charged the creatures, scooping up rocks as he ran. The larger creatures seemed stunned at this type of behavior just watched. John ran right past them and towards the queen. The queen did not have a heavily armored body like her servants. So when John threw rocks at it, it bruised and moaned, and even backed up a little. As much as it could with its bulbous form. The wiry man ran to the back of the creature and started in on its bulging abdomen. That's only use that made sense was to lay eggs. He used the rocks in his hand to stab at the abdomen, which brought even more screeches as purplish-black blood poured from the wounds. The queen was too large to turn around and stop them, but its guardians were now no longer stunned and quickly descended upon John. Buckard watched in horror as the other man screamed as they tore into him with their claws and teeth. Within a matter of minutes, it was over for John. He hadn't had a clear shot to end the other man's suffering. But he could get some vengeance. Buckard took a deep breath and leveled his rifle at the queen's head. He did his best to take careful aim of the soft areas around the eyes. 29 shots, he thought, reminding himself to count them off as he fired. The sound of his rifle cut loudly into the cavern as he opened fire on the queen. The other creatures that had been distracted devouring John now turned toward him, emitting their hunting screams. He shot several of them too, as they made their way towards them. The heavy rifle rounds had torn the queen's head to shreds. She had fallen on its side and now was twitching on the ground, wheezing as she tried to emit the same high-pitched scream she had done earlier, only to have more of the dark blood pour from where the left side of its head had been. It was probably its only defense. Watching the queen die brought Buckard a few moments of happiness as the rest of the hive descended on him. They swarmed in now from every side, completely frenzied. Knowing that he only had a few more moments to live, Buckard closed eyes and took a deep breath. Around him, he heard the clattering of the creatures screeching, their way of mourning their dead queen. The sound grew to a crescendo as they clamored to where he stood. They were almost upon him. Now or never. He thought quickly, tucking the rifle under his chin and squeezing the trigger. Click. He squeezed again. Click. Shit. He had fired too many rounds at the queen and miscounted the others. Using the rifle as a club, he bashed them back as several of the smaller creatures ran up to bite him. Their small mouths and worm-like teeth were tearing large bloody chunks out of his arms and legs. They tried to cling to him with their mandibles. He punched any that tried to hang on. The meaty wet sounds of things cracking under his heel gave him joy. As he swung more and more, he felt something tear into his gut and things begin to fall out. Buckard was beyond pain. His only focus was on his anger and taking as many of them with him as he could. He first realized he was dying as things began to get darker, his vision swimming in and out. The rifle grew too heavy to swing. The dirt floor of the hive rushed up to greet him, it seemed. No, that's not right, Buckard thought, as a sea of black legs and biting mouths swarmed over him. He must have fallen. He could dimly feel things pinching, biting and prodding him. But he could no longer hear the screeching or the clacking, and within minutes he couldn't hear anything at all. 13. The formation scuttled and screeched. They seemed to come in all directions as they bore down on top of Telos. He fired with abandon, the loud shotgun bursts sending hundreds of lead pellets into the horde of U-arrows, causing them to scatter. The blasts ended 2 to 3 of the creatures at a time. Their dark black blood coated the tunnel walls. But still their numbers pushed him back. The creatures were everywhere, scuttling up the ceiling, trying to launch themselves or drop down on him while gnashing at each other over who would get the first bite. All in attempts to get to him. Their screeches and screams jostled his nerves. As he tried to back up and reload, scores of the creatures lay dead, but they just kept coming. Damn it, I need to make it to Tunnel 1. He could see the crossroads, but the only way there was through the hungry U-arrows. Telos couldn't imagine where all these creatures came from. Some part of his mind knew that had been here waiting the whole time, leading him to a false sense of security to put as much distance between himself and the guard station. To turn his back and try to run back would be certain death. His only chance was fighting through them. Telos dug into his pocket, looking for more shells. His hands found only empty cloth. He threw the shotgun forward, catching one of the creatures mid-air in the jaw, snapping some of its eating mandibles and bringing it crashing to the ground on top of some of the others. He drew his pistols, all fully charged. He fired with wildly, filling the tight tunnel with the screams of the dying creatures and the smell of burning flesh. Telos pushed forward, rapidly firing the pistols. The creatures made an uncertain path to lash out at his feet as he shot them. He had caught them off guard with his sudden charge. The U-arrows recovered quickly to once again give him chase. The pistol in his right hand clicked, empty. No more charge. He cast it aside and pulled one of the remaining 2 he had in his belt, firing it without a care, almost clear of the creatures now. The one in his left hand now clicked. Only one pistol was left fully charged. He pulled it, firing several more times. He was now clear of the U-arrows. He stopped firing, walking hurriedly backward as they followed him, slowly waiting to see if they would once again be subjected to a barrage of laser rounds. Telos fired a few more times, hoping to keep them at bay. Pivoting on his left foot, he turned and ran hard to the crossroads. He could hear them behind him, running and clacking their mandibles in hunger. He pushed his legs as hard as he could, running faster and faster. His breath becoming more and more ragged. If he survived this, he decided he would start every morning off with cardio exercises. They were gaining on him. He could hear them getting closer and closer. Looking back over his shoulder, he saw that they were getting closer and closer. He fired several potshots behind him as he ran. It didn't look like he had hit any. His shots were too wild for that. But he did hear the rewarding sound of several of the creatures tripping up as they tried to avoid the laser blasts. One of them jumped back from his blast as he fired. The creature's sudden stop sent several of their comrades also tumbling. "Take that, you bastards," Telos thought with a smile. He made it to the crossroads and could have howled with glee. There was another sound that had him turning. More of the creatures were coming up from Tunnel 4. They charged him. He shot rapidly, turning back to shoot at the others. This time, his shots were a little more aimed and took a couple of the creatures, their bodies tripping up those behind them. Not like this, he thought, not with Tunnel 1 just in sight. If the consequences weren't so dire, the irony of the situation would have been laughable. He fired several more shots, the pistol in his right hand clicked. He squeezed it again. Please, oh please. He prayed. Click, click. He cast it aside, relying solely on the one in his left hand. He made it into the mouth of Tunnel 1. He turned and fired several more times before turning to run again. The creatures scuttled every time he fired in an attempt to get out of the way of the blasts. As he turned again to run, there was a sharp pain. Suddenly, he was falling. He found himself face first in the dirt. He tried to get back up, but his leg was in agony. Telos saw with horror that his foot had gotten caught in the hole as he turned to run. He laughed at the cruelty of it all. The bone of his right leg stuck out of his jumpsuit as he pulled his foot out of the hole. I was right, he thought. I do have the worst luck. The creatures realized he was no longer shooting and started slowly creeping up to him. His last pistol had fallen several feet away from him. He dragged himself to it. He could see the lift. It was already on. Someone had sent up to the surface. Somebody had made it. But not me, he thought, feeling as though an enormous weight had suddenly descended upon him. As the creatures came closer and closer, he grabbed around blindly with his hands, his fingers finally landing on the fallen pistol. He grasped it and brought it forward. With the creatures less than 5 feet away, he opened fire, wildly laughing the entire time that he did so. Damn them all. The creatures screeched in agony as the terrible smell of dying burning arrows once again filled the tunnel. He laughed again, not understanding why that had captured his attention, as he knew that shortly he was going to die. Tears came down his face as his laser pistol made the dreaded clicking sound. He pulled the trigger several more times just to make sure, each time being rewarded with a hollow, definite empty click each time. This is it, he thought. He threw the last pistol at the creatures, sending several of them scuttling back. He pulled himself, dragging his left leg behind him. His body racked with pain with each little drag. One creature ran forward, obviously braver than the others, and bit into his wounded leg, its worm-like teeth tearing a ragged chunk away from the white bone. Telos screamed in agony. Apparently, his pain gave them the encouragement they needed. They rushed him eagerly, tearing at his arms, his legs, and then at his abdomen. Telos tried to cover his face as they came at him, using the only thing he had left, his hands, but it was to no avail. Their mandibles scratched bloody marks on his cheeks. He tore one of his arms free of their hold and dug at his belt, his grasping hand finding exactly what he was looking for, 5 circular orbs that he'd attached to his belt. His body racked with pain, being literally torn limb from limb. Telos popped back the release and pressed the top button of one of the hard little spheres. He was rewarded with the dinging sound, letting him know the grenade was now armed. He felt his left hand slip inside the mouth of one of the creatures as it bit off his hand, its teeth cutting him to the bone and pulling the hand violently away and leaving only a bloody stump. His right hand came back across his face. He tried to once again use it to shield himself. As the sound from the spheres became louder and more violent, more of the creatures swarmed over him. He decided. Then he arched his broken and bleeding body outwards, offering the belt and its contents up to the creatures as they tore into them. The entire world was spinning and going dark. The last sound Telos heard was the booming roar that filled the whole tunnel with fire and metal, and showered it with gore. But even that, to Telos, sounded far away. 14. Saff felt as if a heavyweight had descended upon him as he made his way to the lift. He felt like he was chiseling out his own tombstone. Well, he thought, if you don't make it out of here, at least he wouldn't have to worry about a tombstone any. This place would be his tomb. There was no armory, which he found strange as he walked around this area. He had hoped that there would have been some weapons lying around. Something with a little more firepower than his pistol. Whatever they were doing down here, they apparently hadn't thought weapons were necessary. Saff's only hope was that he would survive long enough to at least have his fighting chance in the tunnels above him. He moved back toward the lift shaft that he had come up in, his pistol ready when he entered the shaft. He steadied his hands and pressed the button that would propel the lift upwards, back to Tunnel 3, where he knew those things waited for him. From what he had seen, the Euros were all about perseverance. With another unsettling, metallic grinding noise, the liftgate again slid shut. He fell backward as the lift jerked, its speed suddenly decreasing as it rose higher and higher. He was sweating profusely, consistently checking the battery on his pistol. The charge stayed the same. "Get a hold of yourself," he thought. He kept trying to think what Buckard would say in a time like this. Something sarcastic and gruff that would make him feel like he at least had a chance of making it out of here alive. About halfway up, there was a loud sound on top of the lift, followed by another. It sounded like something was crashing down on the roof. Next came a tearing sound, as if something was attempting to claw its way into the roof of the lift. He put his back into a corner, fearing the worst as he leveled his pistol to the top of the lift. He was very glad that the corporation had installed a gravity lift in this area of Mine-198, instead of the archaic rope and pulley systems like the one they had first entered on. A section of the roof was torn away, and Saff got the first look at the intruders. It was one of the creatures, scrambling on all four of its front limbs, tearing into the metal roof. It was pulling it back, so another one of its comrades could force his way into the lift. Saff took careful aim and fired. The creatures made loud screeching sounds as the pistol shots burned into them. At a close distance, the pistol was downright lethal, and the lift was soon filled with the smell of burned Euros flesh. The smell alone was almost enough to make him upchuck his last meal. Saff tried to block it all out as he was firing. He watched as the charge on his pistol slowly started dipping further and further. More thumps sounded on the roof. Another hole was torn into the roof, and now Saff found he had to alternate his shots between both of the large holes, but just as suddenly as they had appeared as they stopped pouring in. The lift was now filled with several of the dead creatures. Their corpses sizzling at his feet, their purplish-black blood coating the walls and ceiling. Saff himself was covered in it. The lift came to a shaky stop at the top of the shaft. His pistol charge was now somewhere below 15%. He closed eyes, knowing that depending on what was on the other side of the liftgate, these could very well be his last few moments of life. Taking a deep breath, he raised the pistol in front of him, opening up his legs to widen his stance. Let them come, he thought. He was going to take as many as them as he could with them. He just had to save the last shot for himself. Better than getting eaten. Because with only 15% charge, there was no way he would last until explosives went off. The lift door made another grinding sound as the doors opened, revealing only an empty tunnel ahead of him. Saff made his way cautiously out of the lift and began walking up the tunnel. It was just as he remembered it, flickering lights and all. Yet there was no sign of life. Human or Euros. Perhaps the creatures had just moved on, but if they had moved on, it was only towards easier prey. And as far as he knew, that could only mean his friends. He was taking up way too much time pondering all this, as he remembered he had less than an hour at this point to make it to the surface and get back on their ship. He ran with everything he had. Saff breezed up the tunnel, running, trying to shake off his weariness. Just remember, he kept telling himself, you can sleep on the ship. As if he could ever sleep again. He knew that if he stopped running now, he probably wouldn't be able to later. The Euros had to be here somewhere. As he made it to the crossroads and headed towards Tunnel 1, he heard a loud screeching sound that seemed to echo up from Tunnel 4, or perhaps Tunnel 2. There was no point in trying to pinpoint its origin. The sound was so loud it almost caused him to stop running. Almost. Taking deep, gulping breaths, he continued to run until he came to the mouth of Tunnel 1. With his goal now in sight, Saff pumped his legs as hard as he could. One creature scuttled out from the cafeteria area, directly blocking his way to the lift that would take him to the surface. Without a moment's hesitation, pistol shots rang out, taking the Euros right in the mouth, sending mandibles and teeth all over the tunnel floor. Saff felt like crying as he hit the button to summon the lift that would take him to the surface. He heard the slow mechanical grating sound echoing down the lift, letting him know it was on its way. He put his back to the gate. Only 10% left now. Wouldn't that be something? He thought, to make it all this way. The universe could be so cruel. He heard the sound of clacking mandibles echoing from far away. The UROs were coming for him in force. They must just be at the crossroads. Saff thought to himself. The lift made a resounding thump as it settled on the ground. Tears of joy streaked down his face as the metal door slid open and he slowly walked in. He flopped in the back corner of the lift, pressing the button that would send him to the surface. He watched out the door, hoping to see a sign from Telos and Buckard, but even the comm was silent. The door shut in the lift as it made its way to the surface. About midway up, Saff heard a loud boom that can only mean an explosion in the tunnel below. 15. The lift came to a grinding stop. Saff now found himself on the surface. As the metal door rolled back, he could have cried with relief as he stepped out of the lift 1 foot at a time. He only had minutes left before explosives went off. Trying to shake off how tired he was, he made his way into the command room as quickly as he could. There were no blips on the map, no signal showing any surviving team members or Telos or Buckard. The communicator itself was completely dead. They should never have gone down in the first place, he thought. We all should have just lifted off this rock when we first realized things were a mess. But there was nothing to do about it now. OZA would add them to the list of fallen employees, most likely shifting the blame to a rival corporation. He hefted Telos' bag, adding his transfer unit and the coffee. Then he left. Maybe after this, he would cut his losses and go find a simpler job. He exited Mine-198 and found himself again under the harsh red glare of the system's sun. The dry air and dust threatened to choke him as he took ragged, sobbing breaths and trudged his way back to their ship. It was the most beautiful sight he had ever beheld. 43 men had come to Mine-198, and now I will be the only one that leaves alive. The ship felt huge with only him on board. It wasn't as large as the massive freighters the corporations used to move their products around the universe. Buckard had always said that it was smaller, so it would be light enough to land on top of the surface of different worlds. It was a Salvagers ship, completely autopiloted, OZA's way of trying to factor out human error. And for situations like this, he reminded himself as he gave the entrance to Mine-198 one last look. Buckard had told him that in the early days of corporate wars, it was all too common for the pilots to die first, leaving an entire crew stranded or worse in enemy hands. With a heavy heart, Saff climbed to the ship and ordered its computer to hover 2,000 feet directly above the mine. He had decided that it was only fitting to watch the show. With one of the outboard monitoring systems trained on the building below, he waited. 20 minutes passed before he got his reward. The surface station and the rest of Mine-198 went up in a huge ball flame. Blowing dust and smoke all over the surface of the planet, he imagined that he could hear the UROs screaming down there as the flames took them, but he knew that was just his imagination. He fell back in one of the chairs on the bridge, watching as the ground seemed to sink in itself. The tunnels beneath the surface collapsing in on each other. Taking one last look, he commanded the ship to take off, heading in the direction of the nearest OZA outpost. Several days later, Saff found himself fully restored from his perilous journey. The OZA Corporation satellite station was now in view. He had been in a stasis sleep while traveling. He had played with the idea of opening the files he had taken, but decided some things just weren't worth the risk. They were expecting him, having received his transmission not long after his departure from Mine-198. The station hailed him as he approached. Their operators imputed the command codes that allowed them to take control of his ship and send it on through the docking route. He handed the bag containing both transfer units and the scanned files to 2 large soldiers who were waiting for him as he walked off the ship. So much sacrificed for so little. After handing it off, another man approached him. The others addressed him as Colonel Rudford. The man was tall and imposing. He wore an eye patch and had a jagged scar that went from his forehead all the way down to his salt and pepper goatee. Saff only knew of one Colonel Rudford in OZA employ, and for the first time he wondered if it wouldn't have been better to die on the mine. Have you contacted anybody else about what happened? Colonial Rutherford asked him. No, of course not. Saff replied, trying his best to give the man a "How dumb do you think I am?" look. Colonel Rutherford looked him up and down, appraising him. Good, we might just all make it out of a sticky situation in one piece then. With that, the man just turned around and, with a soldier on either side, led Saff to a debriefing area. Inside, Saff found himself seated across from a table in which two men sat with an empty chair in the middle. He vaguely recognized the two older men as being high-up OZA employees. One of them he was quite sure was one of the fleet admirals, and if he wasn't mistaken, the one sitting to the far right headed up the bioscience division. They didn't introduce themselves, and Saff knew better than to ask. The man who introduced himself as Colonel Rutherford took the empty middle seat. Without further ado, they asked him to tell his story and leave nothing out. Now understanding the gravity of the situation in which he found himself, Saff complied completely, not even the part about the secret compound in Tunnel 3. They had exchanged a look when he told them that, but said nothing. When he was done, the three men talked amongst themselves, completely ignoring him sitting there. After a few moments, they turned back to him. Colonel Rutherford stared directly into Saff's eyes. I hope you realize the serious implications of the situation you now find yourself in, which is why I think I'm being quite generous when I extend my offer to you, he said. Your offer, sir? Saff asked, deciding it would be best to show these men every respect, especially since the two soldiers at his back had their weapons drawn. Yes, my offer is the only one which sees you getting out of this mess alive. You've already proven yourself quite capable under extreme circumstances, surviving an enemy that my own people couldn't wipe out. Colonel Rutherford told him. The fact is, we need you right now. You want me to become a troubleshooter? He asked, dumbfounded. The three men chuckled. It was the scientist who spoke up first. No, we need you to be a salvager, the scientist said, speaking for the first time. That alone lets you go places soldiers couldn't. Not without raising eyebrows, that is. No, what we need for you to do is help us take care of a rogue faction within the company, Saff. Does the name Dr. Livens mean anything to you? He asked. Saff thought for a moment. No, sir, should it? Colonel Rutherford cleared his throat. Not if we've done our job right. Dr. Livens was the head of the UAROS project, a project that was started on Mine-198. It's our belief that he's continued his project and is now operating at his own behest. Saff felt himself go numb as he took in what Colonel Rutherford had said. There's more of them? He asked. The three men all simply nodded. Saff decided then and there. What are they? He asked. The scientist spoke up first. We call them UAROS. What they call themselves is irrelevant. Mine-198 was a testing facility to discover if they could be useful. And they were for a while, until we discovered much too late that they were smarter than we gave them credit for. They managed to get the control collar off of one of the queens. It was downhill from there. A young UAROS queen is a very formidable opponent, and once she begins birthing larvae, near unstoppable. Although now that Dr. Livens has gone rogue, it would be a safe bet to assume he knew that already. Saff nodded. One more question. Who are you all? The man who Saff swore was an admiral cleared his throat. That's not important. The only one of us you need to know by name is Colonial Rutherford. However, we are referred to by a title. The Triumvirate. We act as the left hand of the OZA Corporation, taking care of any operation that the chairman cannot be seen taking part in. In layman's terms, we do the dirty work that keeps this great company afloat in these troubled times. And as our agent, you will work directly under us. Saff realized that it was the only answer he was going to get. Now or never. So, will you work for us? Hunt down and destroy Dr. Livens and his monstrosities once and for all? Colonel Rutherford asked. They all waited for his decision. I'll do it, Saff said, surprising even himself.